Hey my students, how you doing? Hope you having good day. In this video, I'm gonna talk about my student Deku. What if Deku has haki? So what will be happened in his battle, the man with haki and overpower, so watch till end. And subscribe for more, also like this video, it helps me to stay motivate. And don't forget to check it author of this story and show some love, name of this fanfic is A Hero's Will and Ambition by the Real Moku. Also if you have any complaints about videos, feel free to comment, I will try to improve them. Let's jump in video. Izuku Midoriya, then 4 years old, stood in front of the hurt youngster who was being tormented and whispered, I know that no one is born equal. His tiny frame shook as he raised his trembling hands, his green eyes wide with fear as he kept his position. His body language revealed his anxiety as he yelled angrily, but that doesn't give you the right to use your quirk to harm others, Kakin. Oi, Deku, a child with crimson eyes and ash blonde hair murmured, grinning evilly. He slapped one first into his other palm, exclaiming, who the hell do you think you are telling me what I can or can't do, huh? The little explosion caused by the red-eyed child's actions echoed through the oddly empty park. Izuku looked at his erstwhile friend and shook his head in shock. Even though Kitsuki Bakugo was never particularly polite prior to his quirk manifesting, he never deliberately went out of his way to harm and degrade other people. Following that incident a few months ago, Kitsuki underwent a negative transformation, never again giving himself the opportunity to abuse someone who lacked a quirk or had a weaker one than him. Even though Izuku belongs to the second type because his own quirk has not yet materialized, he was not going to watch helplessly while Kitsuki exploited his talent to harm other people. Izuku detested it most when those in positions of authority took advantage of individuals who were weaker than them. He couldn't express it since he was so little, but Izuku was certain of it. People who possess a quirk should only use their gifts to advance humanity as a whole or assist others. He stood in front of the helpless child for that reason, despite the fact that he was also helpless. Izuku realized intellectually that he had no chance of opposing Kitsuki and trying to stop him from achieving his goals. But he didn't listen to his brain's advice to just flee and leave the problem alone because it had nothing to do with him. Instead, his heart and his moral sense kept him from doing so. Morality told his heart to assist the child, and his heart said yes, compelling his brain to move his body in the proper direction. You're worthless. Exclaimed the plump child as he soared across the sky, propelled by his crimson bat wings. The other child, whose left hand's fingers were stretched until they were many times longer than he was tall, scoffed, actually, he is quirkless. But it's basically the same. Izuku held his ground shakily, gritting his teeth. My quirk has yet to manifest, that's true. But if you use your quirks to harm others then you don't deserve them. The pale lad with blonde hair twitched, his face twisted into an ugly grimace of scorn and fury as the two boys encircling him gazed at him. He said, you're overreaching, Deku. Before propelling himself forward and sending his lackeys after him. They struck Deku all over his body, causing him to sob in agony and let tears escape from the corners of his eyes. The child whom Izuku was attempting to shield got up in the midst of this and fled without turning around. When Izuku saw this, he was relieved that he had been able to assist the child, even if it upset him that the child had fled without asking if he could. That was ultimately the most important thing to him. In order to assist others. That's why he was unable to stop his oddity from coming to life in order to save the day. He felt optimistic despite being the only child in the town of his age whose peculiarity had not yet shown itself. Kitsuki's hand smacked into Izuku's forearms instead of his face, as he had obviously intended, causing a minor explosion that scorched his arms and forced Izuku to cover his face and scream in anguish. Izuku lowered his arm slightly and gave Kitsuki a defiant stare despite the agony and tears. Now that his pain was too great to be fearful, Izuku could muster the strength to deliberately confront Kitsuki. Kitsuki froze for a second, feeling something that sent a shiver down his spine and raised the hairs on the back of his neck. He turned to face Izuku and saw him staring up at him from behind blackened arms, his green eyes like steel as he sobbed from the pain of the other two children's persistent punches. But Izuku was hit particularly hard in the flank, causing him to close his eyes and scream in agony. After shaking his head, Kitsuki scowled down at Izuku and then cocked his fist back, grinning menacingly. Izuku was hit in the liver and was now in excruciating pain, wishing it would go away. Even though he really wanted to assist, he detested suffering of any type, just like any other sensible child his age, and his initial reaction was to cease interacting with the source of the pain when it became too great to bear. Izuku was hit all over and pushed down from every angle, making it impossible for him to flee. He didn't know, though, that he didn't need to flee in order to get away from the suffering. Izuku felt the anguish getting worse the more he was pounded, and without anybody knowing, his flesh beneath his garments started to steadily get darker and harder. Everyone missed that except for Izuku, whose clothing were so wrinkled and burned that they obscured it. But Izuku could definitely feel how each blow becoming easier to take and less painful. Their blows are so weak that I can hardly feel them, while Kaken's burst seemed like a regular punch just warmer. Is this my quirk, or what? Izuku marveled in ecstasy, only to scream in agony when he was struck by the same amount of force as previously. What? Not at all. Return soon. He wished for his peculiarity to return, but his plight went unanswered and he was once more forced to take a thrashing at the hands of Kitsuki and his cronies. His assailant didn't seem to notice anything odd happening as he kept hitting him. And Izuku Midoriya was positive that for a little period of time, he felt his quirk activate as he was eventually losing consciousness from the amount of hits and the pain. A tortured smile spread across his face as he passed asleep, thinking that he had finally stopped being quirkless. Kitsuki and his companions ceased beating Izuku's unconscious form after a brief period of time. He turned back and walked away, scoffing mockingly and spitting next to the still body of the person he felt was a waste of space and not even worth the air he was inhaling. His two lackeys boasted to one another about the pounding they had just given Izuku while laughing. You have to give up, as it is not possible for you to develop a quirk, the doctor stated, looking at the small child and his mother with an almost callous expression on his face. A twitch of displeasure occurred on Izuku Midoriya's eyebrow at the way the doctor had so crudely spoken something that would break her precious son's heart. She sighed with relief as her gaze swung to him and she saw that he was more perplexed than anything else, if utterly dumbfounded. He had told her that he had hurt himself tumbling on the ground at the park while playing, so she had took him to the doctor to have treated for those injuries. They also used the visit to determine why his quirk had not yet materialized. Her voice was stern as she made the inquiry, but anxious as she said, "Is there something wrong with him, doctor? Other kids his age have already shown their eccentricities, and my Izuku is the only one in his kindergarten who hasn't yet." The doctor mumbled, after a little pause. "You are a fourth generation, if I am not mistaken, right madam?" "I am, of course, speaking in terms of quirk." With a nod, Izuku moved her fingers, causing the All Might figurine that was perched on her son's lap to drift in her direction. "Yes. I can attract small objects to me and manipulate them a bit," she said. Her eyebrow twitched again in annoyance as her face slightly darkened. "And my dear husband can breathe fire." Although Izuku had a great deal of affection for Izuku's father, Hisashi, his tendency to take jobs overseas and spend little more than 2 months at home annually infuriated her. With a nod, the physician indicated an X-ray of Izuku's left foot. The norm for a quirk to manifest is 4 years old at the most. Your son has already reached that age a few months ago and he has yet to manifest his quirk. If you take a look at this, you can see that your son has 2 joints on his pinky toe. As quirks began to manifest in people, the presence of a second joint in the pinky toe has been proven to be absent in those who have developed quirks. This means that the chance for your son to develop a quirk even as a late bloomer, of which there have been a few cases throughout history, is less than 0, bluntly stated. Choosing instead to glare at him for the insensitive way he was shattering her son's aspirations, Izuku suppressed the desire to throw the All Might figure at him. She turned to face her Izuku, telling him that even though he didn't have a quirk, she still loved him and that everything would be okay. But when she noticed her kind and courteous son looking angrily at the doctor as well, her eyes widened. Well, it seems that he had inherited more from her than just her good looks. He yelled, "You are lying." With a ferocity she had not seen in him. Before turning to face the doctor, he stopped for a while and Izuku's eyes widened even more as she saw the guilty expression on his face. I. These injuries weren't the result of me falling while I was playing. A kid that had no quirk like me was being bullied by other kids with quirks. When I stepped up to help him they focused on me and beat me up. When that was happening I for a moment felt their hits weakening. Even Kaken's explosive punches only felt warm against my skin for that moment. That had to be my quirk. The physician gave him a long look before shaking his head. With indifference, he remarked, "That's impossible. I assure you, you were just imagining things." Having already become tired of his rudeness, Izuku got up abruptly, then took hold of Izuku's hand and carefully removed him from his chair. She said stiffly, then bowed slightly. "That's quite enough, doctor. Thank you for your time. I will leave your payment with your secretary at the front door," she said. She pulled her son and walked out of the doctor's office. Izuku turned and stared at the doctor as he was taken away. Izuku felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as the doctor briefly locked eyes with him. When the mother and son pair vanished behind the locked door with more force than was strictly necessary, everything returned to normal. The doctor shook his head at the strange occurrence and went back to his work. The doctor never noticed that the X-ray photos were somewhat darker than normal since he was in a rush to get rid of them. Not rudely, but with a certain sternness that reminded Izuku that if he lied to her again, he would immediately regret it. Izuku asked, "Izuku, why did you lie to me about how you got hurt in the park?" Izuku hesitated a moment before turning to face his feet. To be honest, Izuku said, I didn't want Kaken and the other to get in trouble. Even though he detested the person Katsuki Bakugo had become as a result of obtaining his quirk, he remained friends with the Katsuki Bakugo who was normal. He didn't want to make difficulties for his old friend because of those happy recollections. Knowing the kind of relationship her son had with Katsuki and seeing the turmoil in his eyes, Inko sighed with loved exasperation as she knelt in front of him and put her arms around him. Being so noble is something worth admiring, Izuku, but if you don't let Bakugo-kun learn that his bad actions have bad consequences, then he is never going to learn that what he is doing is wrong. And if he doesn't learn that soon, then he will eventually mess with someone that is not going to take his bullying, someone that will strike back harder than even he could handle. As his mother was telling him this, Izuku looked up at her, and after considering what she had said, he nodded in acceptance. Even at his age, Izuku had enough intelligence to comprehend what she was saying. For an instant, he hoped he could be the one to show Katsuki how foolish his ways were, but he ultimately decided to just let him alone because he couldn't manage his own eccentricity and because he was surprisingly uninterested in getting back to know him. Katsuki would finally find out if his mother was correct. All he could hope was that it wouldn't come with severe and irreversible repercussions for him when that time came. Inko grinned, despite the fact that it was obvious how strained their relationship was if one looked carefully enough. She had succeeded in making her son understand. Izuku refused to allow Katsuki to face consequences for his bullying, but Inko thought otherwise. It appeared as though she and Mitsuku would speak shortly. She mentally noted that for the near future and turned her attention to the other matter she wished to discuss with her son. She urged him to elaborate without really asking him to, saying, earlier on you insisted on your quirk having developed despite the esteemed doctor claiming otherwise using the results of your test as proof. And when her son declared that he had finally discovered his quirk, Inko believed him. Izuku was not a firebrand, and if there was one thing she knew her son dared not to joke about, it was about her eccentricities and her status as a hero. Thus, her son's claim that his peculiarity originated was untrue in the highest sense of the word. What an asshole doctor said didn't matter. Since people with quirks had 2 joints in their pinky toes when they first appeared, who was he to say with absolute confidence that Izuku couldn't get a quirk since he too had 2 joints in his pinky toes? She found it more likely that Izuku would develop a quirk, even if all evidence pointed to it being impossible, than that it wouldn't just because he said so. Izuku smiled excitedly and made little fists with his palms. His eyes shone. I don't really know what my quirk can do, but I definitely felt it. When Kaken and the others were hitting me, I felt their punches starting to lose power, and in Kaken's case, his explosive punches only felt warm and just a bit stronger than the others. He hesitated for a moment before grinning sheepishly. The weird thing is that it only lasted for a few seconds before it went away, and it didn't come back no matter I wished for it to so. With a nod of comprehension, Inko got up and grinned broadly at him. That's because you went about it the wrong way. Wishing for your quirk to work is not going to make it work. To use your quirk, you must recreate both what you were feeling and what you were thinking the moment it activated. For example, when I use my quirk I don't think attracted to me, but rather I want it here. Your quirk is a part of you, and as such, you must use it as if it was your legs when you are walking, instead of how you use your fingers when deliberately want to grab something. Did you get that? Izuku gave a nod. Yeah. He said, closing his eyes to recall his feelings at the very moment his quirk activated. He could still clearly recall. He was beyond any pain when Katsuki and his companions pounded him till he was on the ground. He recalled being relieved that he was the target of the attack rather than the other helpless child and feeling good about himself for standing up for what was right. He recalled defiantly blocking Kaken's fist and glaring at him, sensing Kaken's discomfort when their gazes connected. Then he remembered the injection to his kidney, the pain that had been there, and how much he wanted it to go away. The blows that were being delivered to him began to sting less and less at that precise moment. Izuku concentrated on recalling how badly he suffered and how much he had wanted the pain to stop and not reach him, keeping this in the back of his mind and understanding what he had to do because of his mother's explanation. Izuku. He opened his eyes upon seeing his mother's beaming smile and her enthusiastic gesture of pointing at his hands, all due to the exuberant tone in her words. When he looked down to where they were at chest height, he gasped with delight to see that they were covered in a shiny black material. It extended from his fingertips to slightly beyond his wrist. He noticed the black substance beginning to withdraw as his focus wavered, but he was able to swiftly reclaim it since he now understood how it felt and it stopped receding into his fingertips. He glanced at his hands and said, "Whoa." The black substance that suddenly coated them appeared incredibly solid, so he opened and closed them expecting to encounter some sort of resistance. When he felt nothing like that, his eyes grew wide. In actuality, he felt just as he usually did, save for the sensation of something I can't quite put it that seemed to travel from every part of his body to the material that covered his hands. As Inko observed the shiny black substance that was her son's hands, she wondered, it looks like some kind of armament. The instant Izuku started using his quirk, she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck and arms rising up to attention. She tried to ignore it. The highly sleek and cool-looking black substance covering his hands gave the impression that there was more to it. Izuku kept flexing his hands in amazement and slowly nodded his head. Yeah, but I can feel this energy going from all over my body to maintain this armament. I wonder if it's the energy used to maintain my heads or something else entirely, instead of my quirk being this black thing covering them. He trailed off as the energy abruptly cut off. With a pang of tiredness, he fell to the ground and watched the blackness move back into his fingertips and then out of sight. Looking at her exaggeratedly panting kid, she grinned proudly and said, it looks like if you use it for too long you will tire, and you won't be able to use it until the energy you talked off replenishes again. Izuku took a few moments to catch his breath, but he still nodded his head. He started to slowly stand up. He said incoherently, a little dizzy, ugh, it feels like I was running away from Kaken and the others. He staggered slightly in place. He shook his head and found his concentration once more. He stared at his hands and perked up. I can feel the energy used to call up the armament beginning to fill back up slowly. I wonder what I can do to increase the amount I have and how fast it replenishes. Also, what else can I do with this energy? Another mental note was made by Inko, this time regarding trying to break Izuku's habit of mumbling under her breath because she knew it could irritate other people. Odds understood that when his father started doing it, it irritated her. Maybe you can project the energy to intimidate others or something similar. When Izuku nodded in understanding, she continued. When I used your armament, I felt tense like when I was watching a horror movie and knew that something bad was about to happen. However, since we know you can create some kind of armor, I believe the best thing for now will be for you to learn how to fight and increase your physical abilities in general. You will learn more about your quirk as you grow. Izuku, wearing a broad smile, enthusiastically nodded his head. Yes. Neither Izuku nor his mother believed that his enigmatic power could be anything more than a quirk because of the times they were living in. Izuku's power could be taught as such since, at the end of the day, it was still a physical power, meaning that commonplace physical and mental training techniques might have an impact on its development. Nevertheless, Izuku's ability was not a quirk. It was more, much more than that. And all that was required for its amazing appearance was a child's sincere and unadulterated ambition to rise to authority and become a hero who stood up for others. For as the adage famously states, the world can be changed with just one man's willpower. Izuku Midoriya's next 10 years were fun and educational. The greatest thing he had ever done, in his opinion, was been to learn everything he could about his quirk. His peculiarity, which he had named Haki, ambition, in a flash of inspiration, was extremely potent in its effects and workings. 3 things were made possible for him by Haki. He could sense everything within his reach while concentrating on his 5 senses at the same time, channeling the power coursing through his body, and when he projected his power outside of his body, he could impose his will upon others in order to either intimidate, terrify, or simply render them unconscious. He had given his quirk that name because, in order to utilize it, he had to fervently wish for whatever it was he wanted to do. For example, he had to believe with all his power that he would always be unharmed and that his physical strength would simultaneously grow in order to employ the first component of his quirk that was previously mentioned, which he simply called armament. At first, it was a little difficult for him to do, but after years of practice, it came naturally to him. Furthermore, armament was more than just a substance that covered his flesh, rather, armament became a part of everything that appeared to be covered with it. It was the cause of the simultaneous development in his strength and defensive prowess. He had to channel energy continuously through his body and focus on his senses of sight, hearing, smell, touch, and even taste in order to sense everything around him, which he called mantra. He could sense everything within a whooping 1,000-foot radius while he was only concentrating on it. Even with intensive training, he was only able to expand his passive range from 100 feet. Anyway, when he slept, that was the only moment he was unaware of everything around him. After 10 years of honing his quirk and practicing its use, he developed the subconscious ability to channel his energy through his body continuously. He could never actively use mantra while engaging in any other activity requiring conscious thought, no matter how much training he had. And lastly, he had to almost aggressively draw his energy out of his body while concentrating on his intent in order to project it outside of it, in order to frighten, intimidate, or knock someone out, a technique he termed King's Will. The only negative aspects of this quirk were that he had to expend more energy to get the desired result. The stronger the recipient's will was, and the more he used it, the less effective and powerful his other 2 aspects would be, until he replenished the energy he lost when he used King's Will. Izuku's mother registered him in a dojo that taught a variety of martial arts, from which he could select to better suit his quirk after he had successfully brought his quirk to life. Because of armament's qualities, he was able to study taekwondo, judo, and muay thai, the three best martial arts forms. Fortunately, he was able to acquire the technical knowledge of all three at the same time because the dojo taught mixed martial arts. After 10 years, he had earned black belts in all three martial arts and was able to smoothly combine techniques from the three disciplines when fighting, thanks to his commitment, work ethic, and unexpected natural skill. After he told the dojo's teachers what he could do, they suggested that Mantra take up meditation to train himself up and become used to the amount of things he could perceive. This led to the realization that training both his body and mind enhanced his available energy more quickly. This led to Izuku putting the same amount of effort into his academics, which thrilled his mother, who had been worried that Izuku would prioritize his quirk development over his formal schooling. Lastly, in order to develop King's will, he enlisted the assistance of the other dojo students, as well as the unwilling assistance of unidentified park animals. This was the source of his knowledge of the power required for King's will to work in proportion to the target strength of will. A cat or a dog could be intimidated, scared, or knocked unconscious more easily than a child of the same age. The same held true for treating an adult as opposed to a child of that age. Because he now had a quirk as strong as his, Izuku's manner drastically changed. But unlike Kitsuki, Izuku underwent positive transformation. He still aspired to be a hero, to stand up for those who were unable to defend themselves. Still, he was that kind young man who couldn't bear to bear a deep hatred and who would do everything it necessary to support everyone in becoming the greatest versions of themselves. Rather, it was his temperament and attitude that had altered. Because of his accomplishments in the classroom, martial arts, and his quirky side, he had a great deal of self-confidence in himself and his abilities. He was no longer prone to nervous breakdowns, and it required a lot of strong emphasis to frighten or intimidate him. This was probably a consequence of his extensive use of King's will. Furthermore, if he wasn't cautious, the nature of his quirk and the training he had to undergo could occasionally make him come across as obstinate and brash. Everyone else initially believed that Izuku didn't have a quirk because of the way it operated and the fact that he didn't boast about it. Heck, folks still believe he doesn't have one. Izuku adopted rules at the dojo that governed how and when he used his quirk. 1. Combat for the sake of combat is strictly forbidden unless it is used to practice techniques or defend oneself from unjustified harm. 2. Never use the techniques you have learned against those who are unable to defend themselves. 3. Be the shield for those who are unable to defend themselves. And 4. If necessary, become the sword that strikes down the wicked with extreme prejudice. Izuku had to use his quirk very subtly as a result of this. When someone tried to hit him, he concealed armament beneath his garments to defend himself, causing them to hurt themselves when they came into contact with what seemed like steel. Because of his subtle application of mantra, he was never taken by surprise, and if someone attempted to intimidate someone less powerful than them when Izuku was around, they found themselves suddenly afraid of their shadow. Because of this, they were aware that Izuku possessed a quirk of some sort, albeit they were unsure of its specifics. Kitsuki was the only person who steadfastly insisted that he would only accept this once Izuku showed it to everyone. Izuku declined to do so because doing so would have directly violated his code of behavior respecting his talents. Kitsuki was always enraged by that since he believed that Izuku was a crazy, quirky, and worthless child who was pursuing martial arts to make up for something he was just not meant to be. Even though he was clearly perceptive and clever, his hatred and rage for Izuku was so great that he was blind to all the signs that suggested Izuku had a quirk. Either that, or he flatly denied it. Izuku was not particularly concerned with Kitsuki's opinion. Izuku simply couldn't stand the explosion quirk user because of his combative, irrational, disagreeable, and impolite demeanor. That annoyed him, as did the fact that Kitsuki was not hesitant to use his quirk to injure people on a whim. Izuku didn't hate him, even though he couldn't stand him, instead, he merely made an effort to avoid him. However, he wouldn't take any of his nonsense and would not back down when a fight was about to start. To be honest, Izuku's parents divorcing has been the only bad thing that has happened to him in the last 10 years. After growing weary of his father spending more time outside the home than within, his mother made the decision to make it formal and long-term. It had become accustomed for Inko to be alone with Izuku, and the less talked about their arguments when he was at home, the better, as she was irritated by the notion of her former husband. Ultimately, it was preferable to break things off before they said or did anything they would later regret. Izuku didn't really care because he didn't know his father all that well. All he could feel was relief that the man who had caused so much annoyance to his mother was no longer in their lives. At the age of 14, Izuku was filled with anticipation and excitement as he realized that he had less than a year to apply for UA senior year. He had basically mastered using his quirk after 10 years of experimentation, so these were the years he was going to devote himself fully to his studies and martial arts to increase its strength and efficacy. Since something will further alter his life, Izuku's initial assumption that this year would be the same as all the others, albeit with him studying and working out more, could not be further from the reality. Something that will set him on the course to becoming history's greatest and most powerful hero. The teacher pulled up a stack of papers and said, "Okay, listen up. Since you are all in 3rd grade now, it's right time for you to think about your future." He had an ear-to-ear grin. His smile going dreamy, he threw the piles of paper into the air and said, "I will now distribute your career aspiration documents, but at least, for the most part, you all have the ambition of being heroes, right?" His classmates erupted in applause as each person displayed a unique characteristic. One youngster stood out among the rest. He had wavy, spiky black hair with green highlights that coincidentally matched the color of his eyes. This was Izuku Midoriya, the student who got the best grades in the class and about whom there was ongoing discussion on whether or not he was odd. He was writing quietly in his notepad, presumably with practiced ease, oblivious to the chaos around him. Izuku was tall for his age, needing only a few inches more to reach 6 feet, and that was a result of his strong genes and the amount of activity he got almost every day. And the only reason he didn't look like a twig was because of the former. Izuku was certainly incredibly muscular without being too so, even though his outfit mostly concealed this fact. Despite being a somewhat larger man than an Olympic swimmer, he was nonetheless quite muscular and lanky. He had the ideal balance of strength and quickness. And consider Scott Adkins from the films Undisputed. Izuku's face was slender, and his freckles were somewhat more noticeable on his cheekbones, since he had the bare minimum of fat in his body for health. Like just now, when he was at ease, his eyes would maintain their typical round appearance, but when he became enraged or focused, they would narrow to the point that it appeared as though their shape altered. Izuku was anything but plain, even though his face was not that of a male model. He was, as many would say, just barely attractive. Well. I know that most of you have good quirks, but bear in mind that using them outside of sanctioned establishments when you are a minor and don't have a hero license, reminded the instructor with kindness. With a mocking chuckle, Katsuki Bakugo yelled, "Sir. Don't believe for a second that I am the same as the others here," as he tucked his feet up on his desk. "It isn't my intention to be seen as the same as those with weak quirks." Izuku briefly glanced in his direction before frowning and shaking his head, returning to scribbling in his notebook. Everything that made Katsuki unique was amplified tenfold, which was the only aspect of him that had essentially changed. He was still a really disagreeable person, even though he had luckily outgrown his more terrible tendencies. "What do you mean by that, Katsuki?" "Shut up, fodder. Behave as such." The instructor became more alert. "Ah, yes. Bakugo-kun. You are going to apply to UA High School, yes." Izuku put down his pen and turned his attention to Katsuki, stopping his writing as he did so. "What? The best school for heroes in all Japan. It takes a total score of 79 to enter this year, right? And if that isn't enough, the entrance examination is the most difficult one too." When Bakugo noticed that everyone else had turned their wide, fearful eyes away from him and had ceased glaring at him for calling them fodder, he grinned. He got up and threw his desk and chair to the ground, saying, "I'm not surprised that fodder like yourself are quaking in their boots at the mere mention of UA High School. I will ace the entrance exams. I am the only one here that deserves to go there." He kept ranting, his face wearing a nasty grimace. "I will even surpass All Might, and then, I will become the highest ranked hero of all. I'll leave my name forever in the annual ranking of the richest people in the world." Katsuki's revelation caused everyone to look at him with wide eyes, but Izuku only raised an indifferent eyebrow before shaking his head in frustration. He grabbed his pencil and began writing once more. He was making plans for the regimen he would stick to over the following 10 months in order to get ready for the UA admission test. He had 2 more days to exercise like he always did since it was Friday, and then on Monday he could begin a more rigorous and demanding regimen. Now that we are talking about it, I believe that Midoriya-kun also wishes to enter UA. Izuku froze at the teacher's comments and the abrupt stillness. When he looked up, he saw his classmates' confused looks, which did not surprise him. Everyone there knew that Izuku had a quirk of some sort, with a few notable outliers, but nobody knew if it was significant enough to warrant a spot at UA. Everyone present was uncertain about how to respond to the news that Izuku had ranked first in both the intellectual and physical components of the school's evaluations. "Alright, folks, but Deku!" exclaimed Katsuki, turning to face his desk and raising his brilliantly lit palm over his head to cause Izuku's desk to blow up along with the notepad he had been using to jot down notes the entire time. "You good for no?" Izuku abruptly seized Katsuki's wrist before it could descend below the level of his head as he sat, forcibly interrupting him. To everyone's surprise, Kitsuki let go of the explosion with his palm, and a harmless bowl of smoke and fire bounced off everyone's head. Izuku tightened his grip on Kitsuki's wrist, pinning him down with his disapproving look as the latter gritted his teeth in anguish. He firmly chastised as he released Kitsuki's wrist from his grasp, saying, as the teacher pointed out just a minute ago, we are not allowed to use our quirks outside of sanctioned establishments. That goes double for you, Bakugo, considering how volatile your quirk is. Kitsuki gritted his teeth and looked at Izuku. Our quirks, you don't even have a quirk, you stupid nerd. Martial arts is the only thing you've got, and that ain't gonna make the cut, and yet you are insulting me by trying to compete in the same league as me, huh, Izuku gave a headshake. I do have a quirk. Whether you feel insulted or not about me applying for UA is none of my concern, nor the fact that I am applying should be of yours for that matter, he calmly responded. Kitsuki looked hatefully at Izuku, his fist starting to smoke. What do you mean by that? His tone was calm but slightly amused. That you shouldn't use your more powerful quirk to try to intimidate others into not attempting to reach further than you out of fear having your massive and frail pride wounded when you eventually discover that there are those who have a vastly stronger quirk than yours. He replied. Snarling at Izuku, Kitsuki felt an artery throb in his forehead. What are you implying, you shitston? That was the exact time the bell that signaled the end of that session and the beginning of the morning break appeared. Izuku sighed and rose to his feet, shaking his head and skillfully gathering his cutlery and notebook, which he carried in his hands. At that precise moment, he noticed that his teacher and pupils had positioned themselves against the classroom's farthest wall in order to avoid getting involved in the quarrel. They did this because they knew that anyone who got too close to them would suffer consequences. With a snort of laughter, he started to go towards the door. He only responded, I'm implying nothing, before grabbing the door's handle, sliding it open, walking outside, and shutting it behind him without turning around. After taking a few feet, he heard an explosion and a bellow of wrath, and he groaned in tired exasperation. Acknowledging that there was no recourse left, he simply strolled in the direction of the cafeteria. He still had to plan out 3/4 of a routine, and he was a little peckish. No. Stop that thief. When everyone turned to face the noise, they saw a mound of mud that appeared to be somewhat humanoid, with pointed teeth and eyes, and was fleeing while holding a handbag in his hand. He yelled, catch me if you can. In a voice as repulsive as his appearance. Stepping out of a neighboring grocery, a skeleton, sunken-looking man with blonde hair began to assess the situation. Someone is coming to deal with that dude, right? He is just taking advantage of how busy mornings are to get away with what he wants. People who abuse their quirks are everywhere. The extremely thin man grinned as his height and muscle mass expanded dramatically as he changed. No need to worry. Why, you ask? Because I am here. The sound of that booming voice caused everyone to turn around and their eyes widened in shock and amazement. Holy shit. No fucking way. It's the path I usually go home coincided with the incident that occurred this morning involving the sludge villain. It ought to be evident by now, as it has been a few hours after it occurred. With a casual glance at his smartphone, Izuku thought, I don't want to miss my daily run. He nodded, locking his screen and tucking it into his pocket. Then he got up from his seat, grabbed his rucksack, strapped it to his back, and started to go in the direction of the classroom entrance. Oi, Deku, where the fuck do you think you are going? I have unfinished business with you. Izuku stopped and spun to face Kitsuki, who was coming at him with aggression. Those who were still in the classroom but had no permission for their homes began to back away, glaring at them suspiciously. Izuku sighed in frustration, using it to build up a gentle king's will that was meant to intimidate and give him a scowl. And I don't have to waste on those business of yours. Stepping back, Kitsuki paled and shuddered before realizing what had happened. What the heck? Why am I pulling away from Deku off of everyone? As he watched in shock, he yelled to himself in his head. Anger began to well up in him, as it usually did. He wouldn't accept that he was genuinely odd. He never made use of it for himself. Never flaunted it, despite having numerous opportunities to do so. In Kitsuki's case, everyone who didn't use their quirk was either lying about it or embarrassed by how pointless it was. Izuku gave his old friend a firm nod, not wanting to lose the chance to leave without wasting any more time. Good day, was all he muttered before rushing out of the room to avoid wasting any more of Kitsuki's time. A few seconds after passing the school's gate, he heard the angry shout and explosion, and he smiled with amusement. Izuku considered his workout regimen planned accomplishments as he moved closer to his head. For the next 10 months, he wanted to increase his energy reserves so that he could use the 3 aspects of his quirk more effectively and for longer periods of time. He also wanted to increase his body's strength and speed when he wasn't using his quirk so that when he used armament, those qualities would increase even more. Fortunately, he could do all of that by spending more time and energy on his training, as well as increasing the amount of time he spent learning new material and practicing meditation. Regretfully, if he wanted to have time to complete something meaningful in the next 10 months, he would have to give up reading comic books and playing video games, but Izuku was more than prepared to make the necessary sacrifices in order to achieve his objectives. When Izuku got to his modest home, which was at the top of a structure that served as an apartment complex, he used his own set of keys to enter. He said, "I'm home." As he headed to his room after removing his shoes. From the direction she had indicated, he heard his mother's voice shout, "Welcome back, honey. I'm in the kitchen." Just before he entered his room and shut the door, he gave her a loud acknowledgement. His room was neither large nor little, and it was exceptionally tidy and well organized because of the moral values that his mother and his martial arts instructors had ingrained in him. His room didn't feel disorganized, not even with all the posters of his favorite heroes all over it. Izuku charged his phone because he would need the extra battery in it for the next few hours and placed his rucksack on top of his desk, close to his laptop. After taking off his uniform, he placed it in the wash basin to signal to his mother that it needed to be washed. Izuku didn't hesitate to take out one of his numerous pairs of exercise clothes from his cupboard. He wore running shorts, footwear that were over his ankles, and a sleeveless zip-up top with a hoodie because it was summertime. Then Izuku left his room and proceeded to the kitchen, where he saw his mother sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out about her, typing on her own laptop. Following her divorce and receiving a substantial sum of money, she researched various financial strategies she could pursue to support her son and herself independently of her ex-husband. She even got to the point where she no longer wanted him in their lives. As a result of her effective implementation of those strategies, she was affluent enough to never have to worry about money again and to spend large sums of money carelessly on whims. In any case, neither she nor Izuku wanted fancy things or an opulent lifestyle. Instead, they were content to purchase necessities and indulge in their hobbies, which included collecting anything hero-related, playing video games, and Izuku joining the neighborhood gym. They also enjoyed watching movies, reading books, and shopping for Inko's newest outfits. Though Inko was by no means conceited, she was nevertheless a woman and enjoyed being considered pretty, even though she had neither a boyfriend nor any desire to have one. She also often visited the nearby gym, where she had a membership, for the same reason. For that reason, Inko had not altered much in the previous 10 years. Hell, anyone who knew her back then would tell you that she had become even more stunning over time. "Hey mom," he said jokingly as he headed straight for the refrigerator to grab a special drink that included the electrolytes he needed to get the most out of his workout. He motioned towards her laptop as he was getting ready to drink. "What are you working on over there?" Inko casually waved one hand over her head. "Nothing much. I'm just comparing the income of Mitsuki's clothing shop from this year with the one from last year. I also need to check the current income and predictions of future incomes of the companies and business I have actions in, and that is going to take me what's rest of the afternoon, so that means we are probably going to have to order something for dinner." Izuku became excited. With hope, he inquired, "Can we get katsudon from Murayama's?" Murayama's had the best food in the town, hands down, and that was his favorite dish. Plus, he hasn't had any for nearly 2 weeks. He had to get his fix quickly. Inko snorted in delight and rolled her eyes. "Obviously, we can, Izuku," she said with ease. They'd had curry a few days previously, and although she liked curry better, she had to concede that Murayama's katsudon was excellent. She looked at her son questioningly as he drank a red beverage that he said improved his workouts. "How was your day at school?" Izuku enjoyed the delicate strawberry flavor of his drink and gave it a quick kiss after finishing it. His lips twitched as a muscle in his cheek and forehead jerked in displeasure. You know, same old, same old. Had to spend the entire day switching from meditating and listening to the teachers drone about things I already know," he muttered with some annoyance. That would be against his code after all. And Bakugo was being his usual charming self today too. "Man, it's getting harder and harder not to use my quirk to beat some sense into him." She actually shuddered at the thought of someone like Itsuki Bakugo turning into a villain with a quirk as potent as his. "I have spoken to Mitsuki about it, but she isn't too worried. Bakugo-kun may act like that at school, but she actually has a tight leash on him at home. He no longer picks on others with anything other than words, and no one can deny that he has a genuine desire to be a hero. It might be for entirely selfish reasons, yes, but that's better than becoming villain, gods forbid," she said. Izuku agreed and nodded with ease. He could agree to that. He is still annoying though. That temper and mouth of his are going to get him in trouble eventually, he was confident. Because of his code of behavior, Izuku was the only one who had not given Katsuki the ultimate beating. If not, he long ago would have placed the explosive blonde on his property. "That's because of the ridiculous number of hormones going through his body right now," she joked. She snorted when she saw that Izuku was giving him a raised eyebrow after she gave him a silent response. "Don't even think of you comparing yourself to him on that matter." Well, you are the same age, the number of mental and control exercises you put yourself through every day, make it only so your body is affected by those hormones. And don't let me get started on the effects of you working out. And she meant it. Despite being his mother, she wasn't ashamed to acknowledge her son's good looks. Every time her friends came together, they could not help but talk about it. She understood that in the very near future, he would have to use a stick to beat girls off. Izuku gave his mother a sharp, admiring glance that made him blush, and he coughed uneasily into his fist. Yeah. Okay. Speaking of working out. Next morning I'm going to up the intensity of my routine. I only have 10 months before I can apply for UA, and I need to prepare as much as I can. So with a laugh, Inko nodded in agreement. She said, turning back to her computer so she could create a reminder, I'll make sure that all of your meals from Monday onwards complement your new routine. Knowing you are going to work in speed and strength, right? Yes, Izuku nodded. He put his arm around his mother's head and pushed it into his strong stomach for an embrace. Thanks, Mom. You are the best. I'll see you when I come back from my run, he added. She chuckled along with him, and as he leaned in to plant a kiss on the top of her head, she hummed with delight. Izuku went back to his room to retrieve his personalized breathing mask and smartphone. After fastening his phone to his right bicep, he covered his ears and lower face with a mask that encircled his head. He cherished this mask because it had speakers that allowed him to pair Bluetooth connections with his phone and listen to his preferred music while working out. Then he left his house, stretched a little as soon as he got to the streets, and then he pulled the hood of his zip-up shirt over his head and began to jog slowly. Izuku had been jogging for approximately 40 minutes, and even though he was perspiring profusely, he didn't feel exhausted, his breathing wasn't labored, or his muscles hurt. That was mostly because of his extraordinary stamina, which he has been developing over the last 10 years, but it was also because of the drink he had while talking to his mother and his breathing mask, which allowed him to breathe in oxygen at a higher concentration with each breath. If you also took into account that he was listening to Until I Collapse by Eminem at the moment, you would see that he was actually enjoying himself while jogging and considering new additions to his training regimen and quirky side projects. For instance, he was currently considering why his passive range with mantra was automatically lowered to 80 feet anytime he listened to music through the speakers on his breathing mask while wearing his headsets. That particular feature of his quirk probably required all 5 of his senses, thus cutting one off from its surroundings would immediately cause it to lose 20% of its efficacy. It made sense to assume that was something he would need to try more of in the future. Maybe that was a good place to start when it came to expanding mantra's passive range. The greater his range, the more time Izuku had to react to what he was seeing, even if being aware of everything around you in a radius of even 10 feet and Izuku was capable of that 10 times over was enough to avoid getting caught off guard. Izuku was traveling in a tunnel at the moment when he suddenly stopped as something moving quickly entered his narrowed field of vision directly below him. He had just passed a shut sewer entrance. It took only 5 seconds for an unappealing brownish-green muck to emerge from the sewer entrance's cracks in the lid. He mumbled, his voice muffled by his mask, what the? A large mouth full of sharp teeth and a pair of yellow eyeballs could be seen by Izuku as the foul mass of sludge nearly reached the tunnel ceiling. An adequately sized invisibility cloak was sufficient to give him the slip, the object said in an obscenely repulsive voice. When it eventually saw Izuku, its yellow eyes gleamed and it smirked evilly. It said eerily, oh, what a wonderful body you have. As tentacles of sludge surged forward obviously meant to grab hold of him. Izuku dodged beneath the initial one and leaped backward to evade being seized by the subsequent one, causing his hood to unexpectedly slide off his head. He dropped into his combat posture and gazed at the repulsive object in front of him. He was right-handed, thus he had his right arm cocked back and bent at the elbow, and his right fist was at head height when he faced his opponent from the left wing. With his hand outstretched, he was prepared to block, parry, or seize any blow. At last, he stood with his knees slightly bent and his legs slightly wider than his shoulders, prepared to move at a moment's notice. This stand served as the foundation for his unique style, which combined judo, taekwondo, and muay thai. Izuku took in his opponent and concluded, judging by his appearance, this is probably the petty thief that caused this morning's incident. I know he can move really fast, but he's staying still, so it's probably limited to short bursts of movement. I'm also quick enough to easily dodge his tentacle attacks. I should be able to avoid danger if I keep my distance until a pro hero shows there to deal with him. I can tell from the way it sounds that he won't let me leave easily. The sludge villain spoke with a hint of annoyance as he sent numerous tentacles towards Izuku, intending to wrap them around him to draw him closer so he could begin the process of taking over his body. Don't try to resist, kid. I'm just going to take over your body. I promise you that it's only going to hurt for about 45 seconds before you can't feel anything else, he said. Fortunately, the child possessed a peculiarity strong enough to confront him. But Izuku had other ideas. Izuku made extensive use of the near-total knowledge that mantra bestowed upon him. He was aware of the location of every tentacle, its angle of arrival, its intended target on his body, and its rate of descent. Even though he knew that wouldn't be enough to stop them, his body needed to be able to respond quickly enough to match the thoughts running through his head. That didn't matter in this instance, because Izuku was able to do it with an almost offensive level of ease. Toshinori Yagi, or All Might as he was much more popularly known, was therefore understandably impressed and a little taken aback when he emerged from the sewers and saw a teenager who couldn't have been older than 15, dodging the attacks of a villain who had escaped him, the hero who was currently ranked first, with a grace and control of movement he had seldom seen before. He saw that the boy's emerald eyes were fixed only on the sludge villain's main body. As he watched the teenager flip over a tentacle that tried to strike his legs beneath him and fall into a handstand in which he flexed his elbows and tucked his knees into his stomach to avoid another sludge tentacle that reached for his feet, All Might thought, he is not looking at the tentacles. Yet he is evading them all without fail. Then, without possibly looking at the other two tentacles, he launched his arms into the air and executed a barrel roll to escape them. Maybe some sort of quirk in perception. That would also account for the fact that when I received one for all, his body seemed more ready than mine. This indicates that the child is intelligent enough to consider how to best complement his eccentricity. Realizing all of that in less than 10 seconds, he scolded himself for letting his admiration for fresh promising talent distract him from his important work. Thus, All Might made the decision to make an announcement and complete the task he began this morning in order to avoid endangering the safety of a civilian. "I am here," he exclaimed, breathing a sense of relief when the sludge fiend turned to face him and instantly stopped concentrating on the youngster. "You." The sludge villain said angrily, and then it threw out a tentacle of sludge that was a little bit faster and more powerful than the ones he had been using on Izuku, who was just standing there staring at All Might with wide eyes as his arms hung lifeless at his sides. All Might dodged beneath the strike with speed, oblivious to the little piece of debris that dropped upon his back when it struck the tunnel's pavement. Cocking his fist back, he made the required corrections so that the youngster he had just saved would not be harmed by what he did next. "Texas," he exclaimed, kicking off enough wind pressure to be seen with the unaided eye. Smash. Izuku braced himself as All Might's strike buffeted him with strong winds. He was unable to look away from the wind pressure that was directed slightly higher to prevent it from harming him and, in effect, dissolving the sludge villain like it was nothing. When it was finally over, he remained immobile, having watched in shock as All Might, his idol and the world's greatest hero, used an empty bottle to gather the remnants of the sludge villain that contained his consciousness, that is, the part that contained the mouth and eyes. "Hey, young man. Are you alright?" Izuku was startled out of his daydream as All Might spoke to him face to face. Before he could come up with an answer, he glanced up at him and took in his well-known bold smile. He had lights in his eyes, so naturally, without thinking, he exclaimed, yes. I'm perfectly fine, All Might. You arrived right in time, just like you always do." All Might let out a loud laugh. Izuku melted. Placing the bottles containing the sludge villain in a pose and grinning as they emerged from the tunnel, he said, "If that's the case, then I'm glad. I'm sorry I got you involved with that villain. I don't usually make rookie mistakes like that. But, in any case, you were a very big help. Thank you. I managed to capture him safely. Even though he appears drastically different in person, he is still awesome," Izuku thought admiringly, his eyes still full of stars. "Shit. It will only take me a few more seconds to exceed my limit." As he tucked the two bottles holding the vanquished villain into his cargo trousers pockets, Toshinori thought, "I have to go now." All Might flexed his knees and leaped into the air, sending everything that was not firmly affixed to the ground flying due to the winds created by the force of his jump. "Well, I must take this guy to the authorities. Keep practicing with your quirk and you will become a great hero one day. Perhaps one day you will return the favor from today. I will be counting with your support." All Might exclaimed. Before delivering the villain, he intended to pause at one of the rooftops to take a little break and replenish some vigor. A few moments before he reached the rooftop, All Might dropped the bottles to the ground below due to his haste. It would take him some time to realize this. When they returned to Izuku, he was trembling with excitement and had a broad smile that was hidden by his mask but was visible because of his nearly wrinkled closed eyes. "I recently met All Might and he informed me that I had what it takes to be a great hero someday. Put Monday behind you. I'm about to go on my new regimen," he exclaimed joyfully in his head as he began to run at his maximum pace, which was much faster than what a person without a special ability that increased movement speed could accomplish. He laughed happily and exclaimed, "Today is the best day ever. You don't even know the slightest thing about it, poor Izuku. That motherfucker, Deku. I'll show him the next time I see him, Bakugo growled, smashing an empty Coke can and tossing it aside. One of his lackeys asked him, taking a pull on his cigarette, "You need to calm down, Kitsuki. Aren't you childhood friends with him?" The other one, the one who could expand the length of his finger, stated, "You are not going to like it if you push Midoriya too far. That guy's mysterious quirk is quite scary after all," as he reached for a cigarette without fully extending his arm. Kitsuki aimed his scowl at the person with the long fingers. He kicked a set of bottles that contained repulsive material and said, "What the fuck are you talking about? That worthless piece of shit Deku doesn't have a quirk." His other acquaintance gave up a puff of smoke. "He does have a quirk, Kitsuki. We don't just know the nature of it." When Mitsuda tried to punch him once in the stomach, all the bones in his hand broke along with dislocating his wrist, and Mitsuda is made of stone. And with how many times two interact with each other, I would have thought you would notice how easy it is for him to intimidate others with just a look and how he always seems to know where everyone and anything is. Kitsuki snarled and then laughed mockingly. He refused to accept that someone with a quirk would not flaunt it. "Yeah right, as if. Mitsuda is an idiot who probably made the story up to not embarrass himself. I'm sure he injured himself somehow. And for the other things it must have been coincidences or something to do with his martial arts," he remarked. Furthermore, the rumors about Deku having a quirk just began 2 years ago. He didn't get one when they were 4 years old. After all, it was impossible for a quirk to appear at that age. Rather, Kitsuki turned his attention elsewhere, tired of harboring anger against someone who, in his opinion, was unworthy. Turning back, he failed to notice the enormous mass of sludge that had suddenly sprung from the ground. "And what have I told you about smoking when I'm around? That's going to reflect badly on me, so fucking stop it, you moron," he exclaimed. Invisibility cloak with a powerful quirk, but then his pals did. "What the fuck? Kitsuki, look out." "Huh?" Sighing, Toshinori Yagi leaned his back against the rooftop railing of the building he had picked to rest in order to buy himself a few more minutes to use one for all and deliver the criminal he had just vanquished without giving away his identity. Finding a replacement to carry on his authority was becoming so urgent that it was becoming a significant distraction. The fact that the low-class villain was able to fool him for hours served as evidence of this. Honestly, it was hard to hold Toshinori responsible for that. Since his battle with that guy 5 years prior, he felt compelled to transfer his power to someone less constrained than himself before the man healed from his wounds and tried to reclaim the authority he once held over Japan. As weak and constrained as he was now, he could not afford to have a battle with that man right now without making a sacrifice he could later come to regret. It was the reason he had traveled to Japan to recruit someone to take over his position of authority. Whether or not they already possessed a quirk was irrelevant to him. Because of the sheer number of inhabitants, Japan, the United States of America, China, and India had the highest concentration of quirk users. Thus, All Might believed he had the best chance of finding a successor in those locations. Especially considering that he would be lecturing at UA beginning with the following year. There was someone he thought would be worthy of his authority. For if he didn't, it would be the end for them all. Toshinori jumped to his feet and turned to face the explosion when it suddenly became deafening. That's when he saw there was nothing significant in his pockets. He looked down and discovered that the bottle holding the sludge villain was missing, which caused his eyes to enlarge. "This can't be happening." Izuku heard the explosion even over the sound of the music he was listening to, just as he was about to turn around and head back to his house for the second leg of his run. His head snapped to attention and he started running in the direction where the explosion had sound. Even though he had seen a glimpse of the pro-heroes on patrol earlier in the day, he was determined to seize the chance to see them again. After only a few minutes, during which many more explosions echoed, he arrived at the scene of the accident. His eyes bulged at the sheer number of people staring down the street, which was strewn with burned asphalt and wrecked property. Nevertheless, he was able to identify the heroes attempting to control the situation despite the large number of onlookers, and as he had anticipated, they were the same ones from this morning. It was difficult to miss them. On one end of the street, Death Arms was preventing the crowd from approaching the danger zone, while on the other, Mount Lady was doing the same. While Shinrin Kamui used his wood talents to lessen the amount of destruction being created, Backdraft was trying his hardest to contain the fires that were threatening to get more intense. That's when he saw the villain, and his eyes grew wide upon realizing it was the same sludge villain from 30 minutes earlier. Did he succeed in escaping All Might once more? Observing that none of the heroes were attempting to challenge him, he reasoned that this guy must be very good. It took him several moments to understand why. Death Arms can't really do anything to him because of his sludge form, which probably provides him a resistance to physical strikes. Given that Shinrin Kamui's abilities are derived from wood, a battle between them would be swiftly lost due to the explosions the villain is producing. The only thing Backdraft can do is try his best to contain the fires, because he is not a warrior. Lastly, it appears that Mount Lady is unable to regulate her growth and that the width of the road prevents her from intervening. Hey, why are the heroes not fighting the villain? A schoolboy got caught. The villain is using his quirk to cause the explosions and the heroes cannot act in fear of harming him. When Izuku heard this, his eyes widened and he concentrated more on the villain's form. He gasped, however, when he saw the villain's sludge covering the form of Katsuki Bakugo, the person he detested the most in the world, whose eyes, which were normally filled with conceit and contempt, were now filled with anguish and pain, as he begged for assistance. Izuku never gave it a second thought. When Toshinori came on the scene, his already sunken eyes widened even more upon witnessing the boy from earlier sprinting madly towards the villain, despite everyone else's calls for him to stop. That moron. How on earth is he thinking this? His peculiar way of seeing things won't help in this kind of situation. There is nothing I can do to stop him from killing himself. How pitiful I am, he watched helplessly, thinking angrily to himself. But those emotions weren't going to linger very long. Play Skillet's hero, Izuku yelled, Bakugo. And dashed in their direction at a speed beyond his previous record. He avoided them without slowing down, ignoring the street's trash and the scorching heat of the flames. In fact, those who were perceptive enough to see it were startled as he continued to go faster. With a roar, the sludge villain shouted, cocking a brightly lighting fist back. You. When Katsuki saw Izuku, of all people, racing towards him and wearing a troubled expression, his eyes widened in shock. Izuku's expression twisted into a sneer as he concentrated his king's will on the sludge villain, intending to scare him. The force of his hostage's quirk caused him to stumble, seemingly out of nowhere, and his fist stopped shining. The only pro-heroes present saw this, and they instantly concluded that the impulsive child heading towards the villain was the one who had caused whatever had happened to make him cease his attack. Then, shocking everyone even more, Izuku activated armament on his legs, covering them in the black material as he ran on, bending his right knee as soon as his right foot touched the ground. This caused him to suddenly shoot forward at a speed that was easily 10 times faster than before, leaving a crater 10 feet wide and 2 feet deep where he had stepped with his right foot and generating a shockwave that caused the air to be misplaced due to the abrupt increase in speed. In addition, he was making a trench out of broken concrete to block his way ahead. What the devil is this? When he saw this, All Might screamed in his head. At 25%, that power easily matches One for All. What the devil kind of quirk is this child having? In the blink of an eye, Izuku closed the remaining space between him and the sludge villain and he grabbed hold of the villain, looking heatedly into his eyes. He yelled in defiance, I'm not going to let you harm him anymore, his voice muffled by his mask, but still audible. With his left arm cocked back, he struck forward, entangling Bakugo by his garments and driving his weapon all the way up to his forearm in the villain's form. Katsuki felt Izuku grip his garments and he stared at him. Why are you doing this, Deku? Izuku aimed his scowl towards Katsuki. He replied, shut up you idiot, and turned on armament on his left arm, seeing the shock that engulfed Katsuki's gaze. Izuku wasted no time in pushing Bakugo away from the villain, sending him flying backwards a few dozen feet away, while he cried out in agony. He did this by tucking his knees under his torso and pressing the soles of his feet into the villain. Izuku lost control of his flying body by flipping backwards. When he landed on his feet, he skidded backwards and continued to shred concrete as his feet sunk into the earth. He threw Bakugo to the ground angrily, glaring at the villain massaging the area where he had kicked him, where he could see the indentations of his boot healing as more muck covered them. I hurt him even though I believed he was immune to physical assault. Was armament the cause? Unbeknownst to him, the pro-heroes present were thinking the same thing. Deku. Blared Katsuki from where he was sitting on the ground. Izuku slowly slid into his combat style's opening position, his gaze darting to him. Izuku's voice was muffled, but it was still audible as he spoke, we might hate each other, Bakugo, but let me remind you that my dream is to become a hero, his right arm covered in the dark material known as armament. It's a hero's duty to put his life in the line to defend those that can't do it for themselves. That, and because your eyes were honestly calling for help. It felt to All Might like her predecessor, teaching him to inherit One for All, had just given him a good smack with all her strength. His heart responded to the youngster's words, and he grinned broadly as he witnessed the boy propel himself forward once more, this time with even greater speed and force than before. He saw the child almost carelessly deflect the sludge villain's blows without slowing down, launch himself into the air, avoid more sludge tentacles, and materialize directly above the villain with his fist cocked back. Armament haki. Hammer arm. The villain was knocked unconscious, and muck was all over the place when the youngster used One for All to hit him so hard that his fist caused a shockwave of displaced air and a crater as big as the street and as deep as All Might was tall. When All Might saw the boy standing over the vanquished villain's form, his right arm was burning from the force of the punch, his smile grew even bigger. Toshinori Yagi hurried forward, ignoring the applause of the assembled people. His whole body trembled with ecstasy and excitement as he stood there, his legs paralyzed. I've located him. I've located him at last. Izuku Midoriya, be ready for, unbeknownst to you, this is the true beginning of the rest of your life. Izuku started backward, walking almost automatically, his breathing mask hanging loosely over his neck, revealing a blank expression on his face. This was because he was so happy and excited that his body and face could not convey it, and it was all because of what had happened a few minutes earlier when he had saved Katsuki from the sludge villain. When he had told him that it didn't matter if they got along or not, he had been completely honest. He had said that if Izuku saw problems that they couldn't handle on their own, he would do everything in his power to help, as that was what heroes did. If Izuku wanted to become a great one, he needed to adopt that mentality, which he did a long time ago. This was his way of thinking even before he developed his quirk. Recalling his peculiarity, he recalled using one of his armament-enhanced blows to defeat the sludge villain. The pro-heroes had praised and chastised him, but they had also established that the sludge villain was essentially impervious to blunt force injuries. When Izuku used such to overcome him, it had taken everyone by surprise and left them wondering if there was more to his quirk than just strength augmentation. Naturally, Izuku was aware that his quirk went beyond that. However, at the time, he had believed that the armament aspect of his quirk was just that, a powerful enhancement to all of his physical abilities. When he realized, however, that he could use it to harm other quirk users who were resistant to those attack methods, he realized there was more to it than that. Though armament was the result of an as yet unidentified energy coursing through his body, it was nevertheless unexpected. It wasn't really startling. It appeared that he would need to learn more about his peculiarity. The heroes and the repair crews had to deal with the aftermath of the sludge villain's attack and the destruction caused by the fight, respectively, so they were ushered away along with the crowd of civilians after everyone had finished praising him and, oddly enough, Katsuki for their powerful quirks. Katsuki had yelled at him when they had departed, saying that his quirk was still stronger than his and that he didn't need his assistance. Izuku had simply waved him aside and turned to leave without glancing back. Izuku remembered that, and his eyebrow quirked. Man, I'm really excited for you to begin our official hero training. But I can have a good reason that doesn't violate my code of conduct to give that ungrateful son of a some sense and manners. I am here. Izuku had a split second to marvel exactly how quick All Might was entering the edge of the entire mantra field. It only took 2 quick blinks of the eyelids for him to catch up with him. That speed is ridiculous, he swallowed. His eyes widened in disbelief when the rest of his intellect finally caught up with what he was seeing and analyzing at that point. All Might. What are you doing here? All Might planted his fist on his hips and laughed loudly. He turned to face Izuku and grinned broadly, realizing that his sudden appearance had not surprised Izuku, but rather his presence. I wanted to speak with you, young Midoriya-kun, he continued. Even at 70% speed, it appeared that the perceptual component of his quirk was potent enough to pick him out. To put it mildly, it was pretty stunning. Izuku's eyes expanded even more, if that was possible. He almost choked out, peering up at the top hero with stars in his eyes. You wanted to speak with me? What about? Izuku thought he could lose consciousness. On the same day, he saw his idol for the second time. And now that idol seemed to have sought him out, especially to talk to him. It was confirmed. Best day at all. He even knew his name, somehow. Someone please pinch him, this has to be a dream. His daring smile persisted, but Izuku's eyes widened at the sincerity in his voice. Earlier, when you ran to face the sludge villain to save that kid. Your legs moved on their own, right? You saw the pleading expression on his face, his eyes filled with despair, and you ran to help him, even though you saw that professional heroes with more experience than you couldn't do anything. Am I correct? Izuku's eyes went wider the farther All Might spoke. Izuku stumbled for a moment after finishing, then quickly nodded his head. Yes, that was precisely what transpired, he said, growing more confident in himself as he spoke. There was a flash of determination in his eyes that confirmed All Might's conviction. I will never stand by idly and watching if I know I am able to do something to help, no matter how little or insignificant it is. Ah, yes. I saw that in the way you moved without hesitation and heard it in your words you said to that boy whom you saved, even though there was bad blood between you two. You moved in to save him because he needed help and it was the right thing to do, he said in a proud voice that was impressed. Izuku's face lit up with shame as a broad smile emerged. Earlier I told you that you could become a great hero if you continue training your body and quirk as you have been obviously doing. But now I know that you can become the greatest hero in history. Even greater than I. Izuku stared up at All Might and froze. What exactly are you discussing, All Might? He questioned, his tone strained and smiled. He burst out laughing, amazed. Izuku was certain, there's no way I can become greater than you. That's simply impossible. Yes, Haki was a very strong quirk, but it was only as strong as his body, mind, and soul let it to grow. Izuku wasn't so naive as to believe that his physical limits would ever allow him to cross a certain threshold. Unlike him, All Might seemed to have no boundaries to his abilities. All Might smiled conscientiously. That's where you are wrong, young Midoriya. Why, you ask? For I have seen that you already have the best mints that a hero could have. One of selfness and willingness to put your life in the line for the sake of others. And if that wasn't enough, you have a very powerful and peculiar quirk that not only allows you to sense everything around you, but it also lets you make others hesitate and enhance your physical strength exponentially. Izuku looked at everything save All Might, who was staring at him with a serious expression. His whole body was crimson, making him look like a tomato. He was unable to speak because he was so moved, joyful, and thrilled. All Might carried on talking. It's because of this that I deem you worthy to inherit my quirk and become the next symbol of peace. The one whose name and presence strikes fear on the wicked and evildoers. Izuku Midoriya. You will be next torchbearer of One for All. Izuku tilted his head to the side and blinked. Say what now? With a gradual blink, Inko turned to face her son. Okay, so let me get this straight. After you intervened and defeated the villain that kidnapped Bakugo-kun, something which I am still conflicted about how to feel by the way. You impressed All Might of all heroes, and he offered you a chance to train with him every day for the next 10 months because he doesn't want your potential to be wasted. Did I get that right? Izuku slowly nodded his head. He tentatively replied, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Yes. Although he detested lying to his mother, the real details of his training with All Might were too sensitive for anybody outside of the impacted parties to be aware of. Nevertheless, he persisted in giving his mother some information, and happily All Might accepted and even agreed with his justification. All Might, Izuku supposed, was just relieved that he had accepted his offer. Although Izuku didn't particularly desire power, he was aware of his limitations, which might prevent him from realizing his dream of being a hero. The solution to that problem was provided by All Might's quirk, One for All, which accumulated power from earlier carriers and could be transferred to a new one in order to build up more power and strengthen the quirk even further. And he would be the 8th carrier of the power, according to All Might. This implies that if I take the power, I will be able to equal All Might in strength and have the potential to grow stronger over the course of my life by accumulating even more power. And that's not even taking into account the improvement of armament and its potential impact on Mantra and King's Will. Still, this can't be genuine, holy fucking crap. With mistrust, Inko narrowed her eyes at her son, and it didn't help that he started to perspire profusely. She was aware that Izuku was being honest with her regarding his training with All Might, but he was withholding something else from her. Izuku knew he couldn't lie to her because he knew the implications would be disastrous for him. Therefore, he wasn't withholding the information from her because he couldn't, not because he didn't want to. That didn't ease her mind about letting her son participate in what would be an extremely risky training program, but with a sigh, Inko grinned at him. I think that's a great one in a million opportunities that you shouldn't waste, Izuku. I will allow you to train with All Might as long it doesn't involve anything too dangerous and you keep your number 1 spot at Oradera. You might want to become a hero, but that doesn't mean you should slack off on your other current responsibilities to prioritize the other, she said with a stern smile that was still present. Izuku smiled broadly at his mother and gave her a bear hug, spinning her around while they both giggled. He set her down when she smacked him on the arm, as instructed, and said, "Thanks, Mom. You don't know how much this means to me, of course I do, you big oaf," she said matter-of-factly, pulling on his cheek with her thumb and index finger, in the same tone of voice she used to speak to him as a kid. She responded dryly, releasing his cheek with a violent tug that left him writhing in agony. You still have all of those All Might posters, figurines, comics, and videos in your room. I think I know how much being offered training by your idol means to you, she added. When his mother brought up his almost obsessive fixation with the top hero, Izuku flushed with shame. With a nervous giggle, he rubbed the back of his head and muttered, yeah. I guess you are right, Inko gave a pompous smirk. I'm always right, Izuku. You better remember that. Izuku felt a drop of sweat fall from his brow as his mother burst into hysterical laughter. Izuku never considered that his lovely and gorgeous mother, Inko, was already making plans for how to take advantage of his undeniable future hero status once he turned professional, despite the fact that she could be frightening at times when she fretted over him. Izuku's ability to impress All Might to the point where the world's greatest hero wanted to train him was sufficient evidence to Inko that she would make a successful investment in Izuku in the future. Over the course of the previous 10 years, Inko had transformed into a businesswoman. As a result, Inko had to spend money in order to acquire what she desired. And Inko's true desires were only 3. 1. She wanted her son to fulfill his heroic goals. 2. She wanted enough money to live comfortably and not worry about indulging in her hobbies. And 3. She wanted lots of grandchildren to spoil. She was aware that Izuku was making great progress towards realizing his aspirations and that she had already fulfilled her second objective. Her third objective hinged only on Izuku, but given his disposition and the way girls felt about strong, kind, and attractive guys like Izuku, she wasn't overly concerned. That evening, as Izuku drifted off to sleep, he wondered about what training with All Might would involve and about the surprisingly eerie chuckles that would occasionally come from his mother's chamber. He would tremble with fear each time he heard them, wondering if his mother's eccentricity had somehow turned into a source of fear for helpless and innocent sons. Katsuki Bakugo lay on his bed with his hand resting behind his head, scowling at his room's ceiling. He roared, his lips curved into a scowl, and the only reason he wasn't blowing everything up in his rage was because of his mother's threat. That fucking nerd, Katsuki thought angrily, remembering all that had transpired that day. How that slime villain had simply abducted him and how he had somehow taken over his body and used his peculiarity to cause chaos. It was the former that infuriated Katsuki, not the latter, which he wasn't particularly worried about. That and the fact that he was saved by none other than Izuku Midoriya. And his peculiarity, that black stuff covering his arms and legs that gave him the strength to defeat a villain with a single powerful blow who was virtually impervious to physical assaults. Katsuki's fists heated with rage as smoke began to trail up behind his head. And that asshole had the audacity to keep something that strong hidden for so long. What infuriated him so much was that Izuku had been effective in doing so. Even though Katsuki had heard tales of Izuku's eccentricities, he was never able to witness it for himself. As a result, he assumed that the school was exaggerating the situation and that Izuku had told everyone this in an attempt to make them think he was interesting enough to breathe. But now that he was witnessing it with his own eyes, Katsuki got an epiphany that sent him furiously cursing. Izuku was clearly stronger than him right now. That was amply demonstrated by what transpired today. Furthermore, Katsuki found it difficult to comprehend that someone his age could be stronger than him. Even less so if that person discovered his quirk much later than he did and chose not to use it out of a foolish sense of honor that served to further restrict him. Katsuki was so enraged by it that he felt like exploding. It didn't help that Izuku had completely disregarded him when he approached him, following the professional hero's insistence that they leave so they could deal with the fallout from the sludge villain's attack. "Bastard, don't you dare believe you are better than me now," Katsuki scowled. "Deku, just have patience. I'll crush you until you die and prove to you who has the best fucking quirk between us." Why are we here again?" Izuku asked, pressing his thumb and index finger to cover his nose. Right now, he was in the municipal beach park in Dagaba. Izuku could hardly take the mix of the foul-smelling garbage and the ocean's salty air because of the massive amount of trash that had gathered. Nevertheless, this was the location that All Might had chosen for their meeting. In relation to the ultimate hero. "Because we are going to clean it and restore it to its previous glory as we train you to use One for All," declared Toshinori Yagi, also known as All Might to Izuku, in his true form, an excessively thin man with sunken eyes and a face. And wearing loose-fitting clothing to make up for his transformation when he used One for All and made himself taller. There was no need to conceal Izuku's dual form, his injuries, or even his current limits because he was aware of One for All. It was made simpler to justify his haste in transferring his power and preparing the new torchbearer for an endless and efficient use of it. "Well, that makes sense then," Izuku nodded. Since he was aware that this location had once been breathtakingly beautiful, he felt compelled to take action when he saw how sorry and repulsive it had become. Furthermore, becoming a hero involved more than just using impressive abilities and vanquishing evil. Heroes also had to assist with simple tasks like this one. Izuku asked seriously, "Am I going to get One for All right away, or must I train before I am able to use it?" He knew that if his body could not withstand the strain of enhancement, one of two things would happen. 1. He will not be able to use the power at all, or 2. His body will be destroyed under the strain of using that amount of power. He had experience with quirks that enhanced a user's physical abilities, the armament aspect of Haki being a prime example of this. In his case, the latter occurred because he was unable to use armament to improve his abilities beyond a certain point until he had sufficiently trained his body to do so. Toshinori gave a negative shake of his head. "Normally, that would be the case, but," he said, turning to examine Izuku's body. The child was sporting summer-appropriate training attire that flaunted his muscles. All Might could see that those muscles were designed to be used, not only for show. It wasn't as if he needed to verify this, as he had witnessed the child's abilities 2 days prior. "Considering that you have been training your body to handle the stress of your own quirk, I'd say that right now you are ready to receive One for All to start getting used to the amount of power it gives you." Stockpiling more power will come after you have managed to successfully handle 100% of One for All's current output. Izuku gave a nod. Izuku grasped his chin thoughtfully, unable to ignore the stench surrounding him because he had better and more important things to focus on. I understand that even though my body is ready to handle the power, that doesn't mean that it is going to be used to it. Meaning that I will have to gradually increase the percentage of power I use in order to not be harmed by the stress using it causes. Unlike my quirk, I doubt One for All makes you aware of when too much power is too much power before you end up with broken bones and tore muscles, I suppose. With blood dribbling down the corners of his mouth, Toshinori smiled. He hesitated, then turned to face Izuku. Exactly. We don't want you injuring yourself too much outside of base strength, speed, durability and stamina training after all. Abruptly, he puffed himself up and flexed his muscles in a posture. Okay. Let us waste time no more, young Midoriya. It's the moment for you to inherit One for All. Izuku gazed up at All Might, his shoulders set and his body rigid, his words distracting him sufficiently from the strange metamorphosis he had just undergone. All Might picked me out of millions to carry the torch of his power and to become the next symbol of peace. Like everything he did, Izuku was going to give it his all to accomplish this task to the best of his abilities. I'm ready to do whatever it takes, All Might. I will do my best to not let you down. Izuku's response appeared to energize All Might as he continued to flex his muscles and let out his loudest laugh to yet. That's the spirit. Now. He trailed off and reached up to remove a strand of hair from his head with his thumb and index finger. He gave it to Izuku with a superfluous albeit too dramatic flourish. Eat this. Izuku gave a blink. What? He virtually shoved the hair thread into Izuku's fingers as he said, in order to gain One for All you must ingest the current's bearer DNA and hair is the least disgusting part of my body that you could eat. Izuku blinked again, then nodded slowly. With some hesitation, Izuku answered, bizarrely enough. That makes a surprising amount of sense, glancing at the blonde hair he was holding between his fingers. He moaned after a short while and reluctantly took it in his mouth, gathering saliva to ensure a smooth swallow. This made him hardly feel anything, but even so, he gagged at the thought that he'd swallowed All Might's hair voluntarily. Whether it originated from his idol or not, it was nonetheless abhorrent. With a cough of blood, All Might trailed off, revealing his actual form. Now, it's going to take a few hours for your body to metabolize my hair and give you access to One for All. So, in the meantime, let's talk about your own quirk. I know that you can use it to sense things around you, enhance your body and somehow distract your foes but I want you to tell me everything you know about your quirk so we can start hypothesizing on how it will affect it by One for All. Well, I named my quirk Haki, ambition, because of how it works. What it does is that it gives me this energy, which grows by increasing both my physical and mental capabilities, that allows me to. Izuku gave All Might his best explanation of mantra, armament, and King's Will, revealing everything he had discovered over the previous 10 years from his quirk. Throughout Izuku's speech, All Might listened intently, never interjecting, merely nodding his head in comprehension and humming under his thoughts. After nearly 30 minutes, Izuku concluded, and Toshinori gave a stern nod. Okay, based on what you've told me, I think I have a solid understanding of your quirk, All Might remarked, easily masking his shiver because that was just who he was. Izuku had so much promise, even just considering Haki and its 3 facets. Izuku could have easily made it into the top 10 heroes ranking with only that. When One for All was added to the total, he was genuinely afraid. It's essential, Yagi thought bleakly. He was certain that the world needed someone even more formidable than All Might to take on the impending threats. Toshinori was certain that the day would come when humanity would enter an era of complete peace and prosperity, with Izuku serving as both the impetus and the fulcrum that held it together. However, it would take Izuku many years to get to the point where his name and presence alone would become a deterrent for villains and evildoers. Furthermore, All Might had no concerns about turning Izuku into a villain or giving him superhuman strength. You might wonder, why? Because there was absolutely no chance in hell that someone who leapt to the aid of someone they didn't like just because it appeared like they needed it would have the ability to utilize that quirk to harm other people or act in a completely self-serving fashion. Toshinori was completely unconcerned about that front. All Might turned to face Izuku with a gory smile. The armament aspect, however, is extremely powerful as they are and on their own. Since One for All stockpiles physical power, I doubt it will affect mantra and King's Will at all. He trailed off, pausing to consider his statement before speaking again. When you used it to save young Bakugo 2 days ago, was that the limit to how much you could enhance yourself with it? Izuku rubbed his chin thoughtfully and reflected back as best he could on the incident. He couldn't really remember much because it had all happened so quickly and instinctively, but luckily it was enough to respond to All Might's inquiry. He waved his hand in a mediocre manner. I would say I could go about 1/10 further enhancement give it or take it. With a smile and a nod of comprehension, Toshinori let additional blood seep from the corners of his lips. That means that you will be able to use 35% at the most of One for All's maximum output right off the bat when no enhanced by armament haki. With that in mind, our best bet would be to increase your base physical capabilities while training you to get used to how One for All feels and slowly increasing how much you can use. Since the strength of haki grows as you do, we will be also training that as we go. After that we can look into using armament haki and One for All at the same time. That's when Izuku finally realized that All Might was even more astounding and terrifying in his eyes because, in addition to being incredibly powerful, his mind was also off the charts. Izuku was relieved that All Might's strength and intelligence did not come from a villain. Someone with All Might's might but without his values and principles. He got chills just considering the prospect. Izuku and Toshinori kept in conversation, speculating about the various things Izuku might be able to accomplish once he trained with One for All and exchanging training concepts and ideas to create the most effective program for Izuku. They made sure to include a time set aside for beach cleanup which they intended to use as control training for One for All. They also had to factor in the time Izuku would be spending learning and practicing meditation at school, as Haki would likewise need to train his brain in order to develop. The final outcome was as follows. Monday through Saturday sleep hours. 9 p.m. to 4 a.m. running with weights from 4 a.m. till 5 a.m. training for strength, speed, and stamina, 5 a.m. 7:30 a.m., 8 a.m. 3 p.m. is school. Training on One for All control, 3:30 p.m. 7 p.m., time for homework, study, and meditation, 7 o'clock p.m. to 9 o'clock p.m. Sundays day of recovery. Izuku was eager and prepared for the plan, which was much more ambitious than the one he had intended to carry out prior to meeting All Might. Izuku understood that it wouldn't be simple and that his temptation to give up would become stronger with each day that went by, but he also understood how important it was for him to complete the task that All Might and himself had assigned him. The attainment of a strength level that qualified him to succeed All Might was his responsibility. Toshinori was holding the sheet of paper on which they had written the program and he was saying, "This is the basic version of the program we are going to follow. We are going to make it more detailed as we go along with adding more things as we reach our goals on the go. You will also have to speak with your mother for the perfect diet to make the most out of this program. I know you can easily deal with it." From the corner of his eye, he saw Izuku abruptly stiffen. "The most important part of the program is getting you used to One for All, controlling it and increasing your output, which is the reason why we are going to dedicate more," he said, trailing off. "Young Midoriya." Izuku raised his hands and gave him a wide-eyed stare. I think my body has assimilated One for All. It feels a lot like the energy haki gives me, but while haki energy feels like water flowing through my whole body in steady and powerful but controlled manner, this energy feels like tightly coiled lightning centered in my core, content to stay like that, but ready, happy and excited at the prospect of being released." At this, All Might arched an eyebrow. "Truly. To me, One for All feels like I have to clench my buttocks and scream and my heart smash. When the time comes to use it. I know that One for All manifests differently from user to user, but the effects and how it feels is always the same. Perhaps it has to do with the mindset you have acquired due to the effects your quirk has on your psyche," Toshinori thought as he rubbed his chin. He buffed up again, shrugging and beaming with anticipation. "No matter. Let's see what you've got." Izuku grinned back and using his knowledge of energy manipulation, he cautiously started to slowly release the coiled lightning that was within of him. Greenish-blue lightning arcs started to appear all over Izuku's body and the smell of burning ozone slowly started to overwhelm the horrible stench of the destroyed beach. Strong winds started to originate around Izuku as the visible skin on his body started to change an orange color, with numerous glowing red veins of power forming over the skin. The sand grains began to rise and whirl about Izuku. All Might smiled, roaring with joyful laughter, and all Izuku could do was stare at his hands in amazement. There was no doubt that the next 10 months would be the most fascinating and thrilling of his life. After 10 months, gazing about the Dagaba Municipal Beach Park, Toshinori made a comparison with its appearance a decade ago. Since the sun was sinking below the horizon, half of it was already hidden, and the sky was already changing from day to night, it truly felt like a different place. He could even see the nostalgic attraction that this place had formerly held. An appeal that was reclaimed because of his efforts and the young man who was standing farther down the beach, staring at the setting sun with the briny water up to his calves. Izuku had seen a noticeable transformation following 10 months of rigorous and constant training. He was 6 foot tall, for example, and his hair had grown a little longer and more spiky. He was also not as buff as he once was, even if his muscles were becoming much more defined. He discovered that this was because his muscles had become denser rather than larger. Although he wouldn't have objected to being as strong as All Might, he didn't think he would feel as at ease. He liked to have a lean build because it would cause opponents to underestimate his true strength. Toshinori had accepted Izuku's reasoning when he had stated this to him. As he kept his eyes on Izuku's back, Toshinori grinned with pride and satisfaction. He was astounded by the teenager's commitment and self-control. She adhered strictly to the program, didn't even complain about sleep deprivation, and didn't moan when the workouts were harder, more intense, or more tough. Having seen him do the same so many times over the last 10 months, All Might thought he had adopted a determined expression in his eyes and a grin on his face, so he did it all with that. Individuals had a tendency to copy others around them, especially if they looked up to them. Izuku had cleaned up the entire beach 1 week ahead of the UA. And he had achieved a level well above what All Might had secretly hoped for, all thanks to his flawless execution of the plan and dedication to his training. Day of entrance exam. He could still hear the trucks that the city authorities had dispatched to remove the last of the trash so that it could be recycled or disposed of. All of a sudden, Izuku threw back his head, clenched his fists, flexed his biceps, and let out a shout. Lightning streaked out of his body in a greenish-blue color, and patches of black armament haki emerged everywhere. The area that was not covered by it turned orange, and red veins of strength sprung up all over his body. The sound of abrupt air displacement reverberated as the water and damp sand surrounding him burst forth, accompanied by an expanding shockwave that sprang from Izuku. Oh my, Toshinori said, his muscles stretched and his smile growing as he became energized by the spectacle he was seeing. Goodness. He exclaimed, feeling the king's will of Izuku seeping out of him as tears streamed down his cheeks. All Might was aware that Izuku would require all of his available energy to utilize that part of haki against him at this time, but even he found the stifling sense of Izuku's will to be a worthy challenge to ignore. Izuku calmed himself after a short while, turned around, and started to walk back towards All Might. The suffocating sense of King's will vanished first, and then Izuku's one for all and armament haki's tracks followed. When Izuku eventually got close to All Might, the seawater likewise gradually calmed down and returned to normal. He grinned and panted a little bit because he was still high on adrenaline. He grinned and raised his fist to Toshinori, saying, "I did it, All Might." "That you did, young Midoriya," he said, matching the motion and giving Izuku a firm fist bump. He grinned as his successor remained motionless, demonstrating that even in his diminished state, he was nothing to laugh at. "You performed almost impossibly beyond my expectations and surpassed our set goals even before the time limit. I can say without a single sliver of doubt no one is worthier of bearing the torch of one for all." Izuku tried his best not to let snot escape his nose, but at the sincere praise from his idol, tears began to trickle from the corners of his eyes. It was also unspoken that, during the course of the previous 10 months, Toshinori also became close friends with Izuku. He discovered his character and motivations, which, more than his extraordinary potential, were what made him deserving in his eyes. Izuku became emotional since he realized that this was the reference All Might was making. Izuku eventually recovered his composure, pulling his fist back and letting it drop to his side as his body sagged and his muscles relaxed. He exhaled in relief as the adrenaline left him, leaving him feeling a little lightheaded but with enough stamina to continue. He grinned at his hero. Izuku pounded his right fist in his chest and exclaimed, "Thanks for everything, All Might. I will try my damn hardest to live up to your expectations and to never stray away from my path and the path you have given me the opportunity to walk on. That, I promise you." With an almost dismissive sweep of his hand, he spoke epically, "I know you are going to do so and more, my boy. Why? Because I chose you and you have proven it time and time again. I know you are not going to let me down. For now, you have earned yourself a well-needed prolonged rest. I know that not training for a single day for you is impossible, but do your best to take it easy and get some R&R time. Use this period of time to let your body heal fully so you can be at your 100% for the UA entrance examination." Izuku nodded sympathetically and replied, "Will do." Before taking a towel he took out of his backpack which had been lying next to All Might's foot the entire time to dry his body. After that, he removed his breathing mask from its neck strap and stored it. After getting out a loose sleeveless shirt that hung down to his thighs, he put it on and took out a water-filled flask. At last, Izuku fastened his backpack and grinned once again at All Might. "Thanks again. I'll see you around, I guess." Toshinori grinned wryly as he watched Izuku turn to leave. He had revealed practically everything to Izuku, with the exception of the real source of One for All, his sensei's demise, and the impending threat he would unavoidably have to face, but he had kept one important detail from the latter. He would be teaching at UA moving forward. Despite the fact that he had only used One for All sparingly during the previous 10 months, he still carried the embers of it inside him, but he was spending less and less time in his enhanced form, which meant that One for All was now fully Izuku's and no longer really his. This meant that if he wished to save one for all long enough to be of assistance when that man did, ultimately, reappear, he could no longer actively work as a pro-hero. The cherry on top was that it would allow him to monitor his successor and support the coming generation. Thank goodness, the UA. He had warned the staff about the impending threats, and they had agreed to make subtle adjustments to the hero program, making it more intense and focused on battle, rather than other parts of being a hero. Given the impending storm, it was something that had to be done. In any case, he had not disclosed this to Izuku, since he was aware that the child with the black hair and green highlights would believe that he had used his power to secure his admission to the school. Even though All Might was above doing such actions, Izuku still had cause for concern about the likelihood of such happening. The actual cause was. His cell phone rang. Toshinori took it out of his pocket after reaching inside. After a few moments of staring at the television, he had an anxious expression and his whole body began to shake with unexpected panic. He sighed shakily and took the phone. Hello. And from the opposite side came the old. Oi, Toshinori-kun. What is this I hear that you will be teaching at UA? Finally decided to pass on one for all and settle down for once. You should have done that years ago, if you ask me, you dumb kid. All Might mumbled a response, clinging, but managing to smile in the end. Yes, Gran Torino-sensei sir. I will be working for UA High School as the Foundational Hero Studies teacher for Class 1A. And, yes. I have already passed on one for all. I did so 10 months ago. As a matter of fact, I have just finished training him to an acceptable level, you could say. The elderly voice spoke again, much more calmly, after a brief silence from the other end. Gran Torino responded, I see. Good for you, Toshinori-kun. It was about damn time. You were even older than even she when you were made her successor, and the two were silent for over a minute in honor of the deceased colleague of Toshinori and best friend of Gran Torino. After the event ended, Gran Torino went on. So, is the brat you chose any good? All Might threw back his head and began to laugh heartily. Oi, don't go around losing your mind before even I do. Even though All Might compassed himself, a few stray laughs left him when he responded. Good, you ask. If there is one thing I am 100% sure of, Gran Torino-sensei, is that Izuku Midoriya, the ninth bearer of One for All, is easily stronger than I was when I graduated from UA. And he is only 15 years old. Gran Torino spoke, but he only said one word throughout the nearly 30-second pregnant wait on the other end. Damn. Considering that Momoyaoi Rozu lived with her family in the Aichi prefecture, she realized that her only option if she wanted to attend the greatest hero school available was to go to Musatafu in order to be close to the United States. She had been accepted into the prestigious school because of her family's recommendation, and although she had aced the paper exam, her goal was to put her skills to the test in the renowned practical exam. It was her insistence on traveling alone that she was regretting now. Yes, she loved her parents unconditionally, but sometimes she found them to be so controlling that it was annoying. Her only response was that one since she realized they didn't want to control who she was or what she wanted to do, but rather that they did it out of love and concern for her. She had even mentioned in passing at dinner that she wanted to apply for the UA, which is how they had obtained the reference. They informed her of their birthday present to her. She might have had the best day of her life to date. When they had wanted to accompany her to the gorgeous penthouse they had prepared for her to live in, to help her settle in, to show her around the city, and to make sure she had all she needed. She had instantly put her foot down, saying that they couldn't help her learn to fend for herself, since she wanted to start that process. Fortunately, her parents were wise enough to realize that she was correct and that, given her ambition to become a pro-heroine and everything, they had to allow her the freedom to develop into a woman. Mom, you and your dominant genes are to blame for this. She turned to face the three shady-looking males who were staring at her with lustful eyes and obscene smiles, screaming in her head as she did so. The last one appeared normal save for the fur covering his face and the sharp-looking claws on his hands. One of them had tentacles in place of limbs, the other had a shark-like face and teeth matching, and the third had both. She pushed her suitcases between them to act as a barrier and yelled at them, "Stay back." She seemed pretty compassed on the outside, but she was in a panic. She didn't want to get into problems on her first day in the city and risk her already guaranteed entry into the United States of America, even if she could utilize her quirk creation to deal with them. Rather, she was only waiting for them to get close enough so she could use the hand-to-hand skills her father had taught her to exactly handle circumstances such as these. The one with the fur and claws said, "Come on, Missy. Show us a good time and we might make it worthwhile for you," and the other two nodded as they walked up to him. Fortunately, though, just as she was about to let go of her bags and drive her knees into the tentacle-wielding man's crotch, a flask of water that was still partially visible jumped out and struck the man's temple with shark-like features so forcefully that she was barely able to see it. But such force was the flask flung that the man, already unconscious and suffering from a severe cut that was already flowing, was propelled flying. A teen her age, or perhaps older, came virtually flying and drove his knee into the tentacle-wielding man's face before Momo had a chance to even turn to see where the flask had come flying from. His elbow then lowered to smack him on the top of the head while he was still in the air, and she watched with wide eyes. He then grabbed the man by his tentacles with such quick reflex that she nearly gasped, whirled around, pivoted, and slammed him into the ground with enough force to leave the unconscious man's shape as an indent on the alley's pavement. Momo's eyes widened as she watched the man with the fur and claws come at the teenager from behind at a pace that she knew would be tough for even her to handle, flaunting his evil claws that were ready to stab him through the back. "Watch out," she exclaimed, but she also understood that he couldn't turn around, assess the danger, and take appropriate action by now. Thus, to her surprise and probably that of his assailant as well, he tipped his body sideways without turning to face the claw, allowing it to miss him by a mere centimeter. He did not turn his head, instead, he brought up his arm abruptly and used his elbow to break the assailant's nose, stunning him as the power of the blow caused his head to fall back. The teenager landed a flawless reverse roundhouse kick, then spun once and hopped, catching the man's temple with the back of his foot. With that, the man fell like a bag of potatoes. Momo, whose eyes were still wide, watched the teenager as he exhaled slowly, a response she knew was appropriate for someone trying to collect themselves after an intense burst of excitement. The sleeveless shirt and shorts he was wearing allowed her to appreciate his superb muscle and his gorgeous appearance, which made her blush slightly. When he bowed to pick up his flask, she shook her head and looked away. "Hey, are you alright?" She turned to face him at the sound of his voice, which was quite pleasing to her ears, only to blush once more upon meeting his worried green eyes. She also noted that his slightly freckled cheeks were blushing a little and that his curly, spiky hair looked great with his sharp face. She thought almost giddily to herself, coming here to live alone might not be so bad after all, before answering. She bowed deeply and exclaimed, "Oh, yes. I am, thanks to you." Izuku reddened upon realizing this and began to wave his hands in a nearly hysterical manner. "There's no need to thank me. It wasn't a big deal, really. I was just passing through and saw your predicament. I just had to help," he stated with honesty. It was getting late and he was merely coming home, so he chose to take a shortcut through the less desirable area of the city. Thanks to the passive mantra of his haki, he had came hurrying to help as soon as he realized what was going on. He gave a tense laugh. Izuku looked her over and told himself that he was inspecting her like a martial artist. "Besides, to me it looked like you were about to do the same to them." Her mature figure looked great in her knee-high boots, short jean skirt, and top. Certainly, he was not noticing that. Momo felt ashamed when she saw him examining her, but it was also oddly exciting to see that he seemed to like what he saw. She stroked her right forearm with her left hand and gave him a humble grin. "Well, yeah. I couldn't use my quirk to deal with them since it is against the law to do so without a license, but I know enough to hand to get by. But seeing the speed at which the man with the fur and claws moved, I doubt it would have been as easy for me as it was for you. It didn't even take you 15 seconds to knock the three of them out," she said, also appreciating the way he blushed at her compliments. I have practiced martial for more than a decade now, so dealing with men like them is easy for me, since I am used to fighting others that are way better than me," he replied, which was the truth. Even though he had already trained with all might and was stronger and more powerful than his masters in the dojo, they were still able to kick his ass due of their expertise and mastery of the many techniques of their craft. Furthermore, it would be best to keep his bi-monthly altercations with All Might quiet. He turned his attention to something else she said. "So, what can you do with your quirk?" Momo scowled at the way he phrased the question, but she shrugged her shoulders, causing Izuku to flush, as the gesture made her noticeable features do intriguing things. Naturally, she saw this, but rather than being irritated, she was amused that he glanced aside, seeming even more ashamed than she did, and oddly pleased that she had that impact on him. "I am able to create anything with the fatty tissue in my body, as long as I know what I am creating," she said, raising her hand to make two dice that appeared to be created out of the back of her palm. He looked at her hand and muttered, "Whoa," in a way that made Momo feel a little awkward. He looked at her in amazement and said, "Wait, are you telling me that if you know the components of an atomic, you can just make it using your quirk?" She hesitantly turned away, blushing under his intense gaze. Theoretically speaking I could, yes. But since I have to use my fat cells to create something, there is a limit to just how much and how powerful the creation would be. I would have to eat constantly for a long period of time while creating the parts of the bomb. And then I would have to assemble it, which would take more time." Izuku gave a sympathetic nod. "That makes a lot of sense. But still, holy crap. With enough time and food in your hand you can do literally anything. The world is lucky that someone with a quirk like yours isn't a villain," he went on and raised an eyebrow at her response. His eyes narrowed as he said, "You are not going to be a villain, are you?" Seeing the humorous glitter in them, Momo rolled her eyes, scoffed in good humor, and felt strangely flattered that he would think of someone like her as a very serious threat if she became a villain. "For your information, no, I'm not planning on becoming a villain. Quite the contrary actually. I will be attending UA High School when the new school term starts," she remarked in a confident tone. Izuku became excited. He said excitedly, "That means we will be seeing each other during the examination next week." He noted that she was avoiding her gaze and moving her feet nervously when she did not react. "What's the matter?" I kinda got a recommendation, and because of it, I don't have to take the practical exam, which means that technically I have already been accepted, even if the acceptance letter hasn't been sent yet," she replied with excitement. When she told him, she thought he would lash out at her and call her a cheater, just like her old high school buddies had done. For some reason, she could feel her chest getting almost unbearably constricted at the prospect of this boy disliking her. "Damn, you must be more awesome than what I already thought you were. You got a recommendation to enter UA, and it got accepted. I can't wait to see what you are capable of." Sorry. I'm only now realizing that I don't know your name. Mine's Izuku Midoriya. "Nice to meet you," he remarked. Her cheeks turned a healthy pink and she gave him her greatest smile in a long time after blinking at him in disbelief for a few moments. He glanced at her and she liked the color in his cheeks. "My name is Momo Yaoi Rozu. Please call me Momo Midoriya-kun. Only if you call me Izuku," was his quick, quite instinctive reply. Despite having only recently met, they both reddened with humiliation when they finally understood what the other was asking of them. They began to laugh a few seconds later. After a few prolonged minutes of merriment, they eventually became quiet. Izuku offered his arm to her and gestured towards the alleyway's exit with a theatrical flourish. "Well, Momo, I will have to insist on escorting you to your abode, seeing that this part of town is not the best place for a beautiful woman such as you." Momo smiled as he took one of her suitcases from her with the hand of the arm she wasn't holding, blushing at the remark and accepting his offer to connect her arm with his for it. She trailed him on his game and remarked, "The kind offer is appreciated and very much accepted, good sir. You will be doing this lady a grand service with your actions, excellent." He declared triumphantly, and then, after placing her bags on the ground, he elegantly took out his mobile. "But first, I believe the authorities should be notified of what this lot tried to do to you, yes? They should arrive here in a few minutes, and taking our testimonies won't take more than 5 minutes." Momo gave him a sign of approval as she observed him reporting the incident to the police. But the knowledge that they would have to wait in the alley for a short while longer, Momo asked him a question that had been bothering her ever since they discussed her peculiarity. "So, what's your quirk? I noticed that you only used martial arts to deal with those guys." With a smile on his face, Izuku lifted his hand from his mobile and reached back to pick up her suitcase. His hand was suddenly covered with a shiny black substance that appeared to be stronger than steel, and her eyes grew wild. "My quirk is called Haki Ambition, and what it does is." The cops arrived a few minutes after Izuku began talking about his peculiarity, but they had been talking about each other's oddities and experiences ever after Momo and Izuku discovered each other arms still linked. Izuku would later be astounded to learn how simple it was to communicate with Momo, and that the only thing he had kept from her was the information about One for All and his relationship to the top hero. That was something he was only going to divulge to his successor when the time came for him to make a decision. Ultimately, they discovered that they had been holding hands since shortly after exchanging pleasantries when they got to her apartment complex. They were both humiliated, and it had not made any difference that everyone was giving them funny glances. Nevertheless, they traded phone numbers and agreed to keep in touch frequently for the duration of the time between now and the start of the term. Izuku felt a peculiar sense of pride in himself that he likened to the satisfaction of finishing All Might's program exactly as written. He dared to claim that something felt better, but he wasn't really sure why. It just took Inko a few seconds to get her eyes widening upon seeing his distant expression and hot cheeks when he eventually made it to his residence. She looked in disbelief as Izuku snuck into his room and shut the door. She thought to herself, softly, he hasn't been accepted yet and he's already met a girl that he likes. And then she abruptly began to violently pump her fist. She hissed with delight, "Yes. Grandbabies. Here I come. Get ready to be spoiled to death by Inko Abachan." Izuku put his phone into the pockets of his black and green tracksuit trousers after double-checking his arrangement for the third time. He zipped up the matching jacket to reveal his white shirt below, but he barely adjusted it halfway. He exited his room and made his way to the kitchen, his personalized breathing mask dangling around his neck. He wasn't shocked to see his mother drinking coffee and reading anything on her tablet while still in her pajamas, given the early hour. He smiled and said, "Good morning, Mom," as he sat down next to her. He thanked her right away for the fruit salad, yogurt and sandwiches that she had provided for breakfast. After taking a drink of her caffeinated goodness, she said, "Good morning to you too, dear." Observing him eating his meal peacefully, she arched an eyebrow. With dubious amusement, she asked, "Are you really feeling as calm as you look? Today is the big day after all." Izuku was always worrying about his impending tests, whether he was sprinting about the neighborhood or grinning foolishly at his phone. Really, she had nothing against him. Even though her kid was intelligent, he was still an adolescent who was ready to take the first significant step towards realizing his aspirations. He was correct to be anxious. "Not at all," Izuku calmly and quickly said. His words and the shaky smile on his face betrayed his feelings. "I feel like I am about to die, but I think I did all the fretting I could during the week. There is no point on showing how nervous I am at this point. The only thing that's left to do is go there and do my best to not disappoint myself and those who support me," he said with conviction. But the snort, Inko stretched out and gave him a loving pinch on the cheek. "And as I have been telling you the entire week, you shouldn't worry. You know you are more than prepared for those exams, especially the practical one. It's obvious you will be using your quirks in some way, and you have been training with all might for the past 10 months. You've got this on the bag," she said with an almost dismissive tone while releasing his cheek quickly. Then, ignoring her son's cheek rubbing, she gave a mischievous smile. "What you should be nervous about is that girl you have been talking to lately. What's her name? Momoyaoi Rozu, Izuku's face turned redder than a tomato in less than a second. He merely averted his gaze out of shame and remained silent. He felt bad about informing his mother about his meeting with the first person his age he could honestly call a buddy in a long time. His mother was certain that they liked each other and were secretly dating because they had been in contact during the week, which made him pleased to know that she also thought of him as a friend. And although he would be a fool to deny that Momo was stunningly attractive and seductive, what he truly appreciated about her was her intelligence and her sincere desire to demonstrate her potential as a powerful hero. Izuku felt confident in her ability to accomplish so and more because of her unique quirk, which he had made sure to point out to her whenever she tried to minimize her own abilities, something he had observed she was occasionally inclined to do. He whispered, "We are just friends, Mom," after finishing his breakfast. His mother shook her head, signaling that she would wash the plates instead of him taking them to the wash basin. Izuku nodded to her, shrugging, and put the plates back on the table. "I guess I'll be going now. Since I'm going to be running there to warm up and loosen up my body, I have to leave now if I want to be on time." Inko gave Izuku a nod of the head and waved for him to approach her. As he stood in front of her, she extended her arms and lifted his head to give him a forehead kiss. He grinned up at him and touched his arm. "Good luck, honey. I want you to remember that no matter what happens, I am proud of you and I love you with all my heart." Izuku grinned at his mother from below. "Thank you, Mom. I love you too," he added, giving her a gentle head-to-torso embrace. Before Inko gripped his flank and pushed him out of the house, begging him to hurry, they held one another. Laughing, Izuku followed orders. Izuku exited his flat by shutting the door and adjusting his mask to cover his ears and the bottom portion of his face. The mask also included integrated headphones. Subsequently, he dug his phone out of his pocket and adjusted it to play music while traveling to the United Arab Emirates. He hardly had time to accomplish that before a message appeared and the phone vibrated on his palm. It said, "Momo-chan. Izuku-kun, good morning. I'm hoping for the best for you today. I'll be cheering you on. After you're done, give me a call to let me know how it went." He responded to the letter with a goofy smile, expressing gratitude and admiration. Following that, he opened his music app, Spotify Premium FTW, and, in the midst of a hip-hop session, he selected the random bottom song from that playlist. His expression instantly lit up with excitement as Beast, Southpaw Remix, Rob Bailey and the Hustle Standard feat. Ekn9, KXNG Crooked and Busta Rhymes started blasting in his ear. The music had such a profound effect that Izuku chose not to utilize the stairs. Rather, he ran in the direction of the railing in the hallway leading to his apartment and he leaped over it with his arm, falling to the ground from the 5th story without any assistance. He bent his knees to lessen the stress of the fall and only left tiny indentations in the concrete where his feet were, channeling armament to his muscles and ligaments at the last second. He smoothly pulled the hood of his undershirt over his head and then, without pausing for even a second, he was driving full speed towards UA Academy. His form was practically a blur as he moved as quickly as he could without fully enhancing his legs, which, incidentally, was still far faster than the average person without body enhancements for eccentricities. He thought to himself, so far, so good, as he flew through the streets, dodging people with ease and not slowing down because of passive mantra. It seemed like a promising day ahead and all he could hope for was that it continued that way. It took Izuku around 30 minutes to get to the UA grounds and the sight of the enormous fencing, the commanding door and the extremely tall buildings that were connected to one another more than amazed him. He was aware that the most well-known hero school in Japan was housed on enormous grounds that could accommodate numerous training areas and amenities spanning miles. He was aware that the surface he was seeing was not the whole story. He disregarded the looks of curiosity and amusement that other teenagers entering UA were shooting at him. Appropriate as he pressed the button to mute the music on his headphones, pulled back his hood, and removed his breathing mask. Izuku concluded that them seeing him in athletic attire was definitely strange as they were all dressed in their school uniforms. Izuku shrugged, not caring that much. Although it was anticipated, it was not necessary to wear your uniform. And it was out of the question to wear a stuffy uniform, as Izuku was going to be running here. "Fuck off, Deku," growled a well-known, if a little bit deeper voice. Izuku pivoted and arched an eyebrow at witnessing Katsuki Bakugo approaching him with a scowl on his face, like to a juvenile. Though Katsuki hadn't altered much, Izuku saw that he was considerably taller and more muscular than when he'd last seen him at school, which was nearly 2 months earlier. "Get the fuck out of my way or die," Izuku dully replied, crossing his arms, "considering that you only need to change direction slightly to not bump into me, I find your request pointless." With a growl, Katsuki appeared ready to unleash his special ability on Izuku, but he decided against it in front of the UA on the examination day. So he just grunted and changed how he was walking by Izuku without saying anything else. Izuku shook his head in disappointment as he watched him leave. He questioned himself sarcastically, he isn't going to grow up anytime soon, is he? A few moments later, he shrugged his shoulders and, trailing the other optimistic applicants, began to go towards the building. That's when he saw her, a really attractive female with shoulder-length hair and 2 long fringe framing her face. She had brown hair. When she seemed to realize that she was walking beside him as well, her brown eyes regarded him with wonder. Izuku noticed his outfit and gave him a funny look. Her cheeks bulged and she put her hand in front of her lips while clearly trying not to laugh. With an indifferent expression, he noted the pads that resembled animal pads at the tips of each finger. "No, I did not forget to wear my uniform if that's what you are thinking," he remarked. But he blushed a little when he saw her thin but attractive figure, dressed in a jacket, long stockings, and a short skirt. The girl tried to suppress her laughter, but she didn't appear to notice. When she had calmed down, she apologized, saying, "It's just seeing everyone in their uniform and suddenly seeing you wearing those clothes struck as funny for how random it was." Izuku grinned. "Ah, yes. I also find random and sudden things that happen funny." He stopped and quickly added, "Of course, that's excluding when scary monsters and villains pop out in movies and such. That's not fun at all." The girl said, "I agree." With a smile before she gave him a questioning glance. She was now focusing on Izuku and blushing as she noticed his tall, muscular build, gorgeous face, and kind green eyes. So, why are you wearing those clothes? I'm used to running first thing in the morning every day and didn't want to stop doing it even for one day or not sleep enough to get it done and then come here, so I decided to come here running from house as a compromise," he said, feeling somewhat ashamed of himself. The girl gave a charming little nod of understanding. "Ah, I get it. You didn't want to risk having bad luck by doing one of the things in your daily routine in a day as important as this one." Izuku gave her a quick blink, then grinned and laughed. "You can say that, yes." She chirped once again, "Cool." Before putting her fist in the air and smiling broadly. "Let's do our best, Deku-kun." Izuku stopped suddenly, causing her to halt as well, and turned to face him bewildered. He raised both of his eyebrows to his hairline and gave her a confused look. "Where did you hear that?" The girl blushed a little and anxiously massaged the back of her head. She looked ashamed at her audacity and said, I kinda overheard what that blonde guy with a mean expression called you when I first noticed you and you two seemed to know each other, so I assumed that it was your name." Izuku shook his head and snorted with laughter. "No, that's just how Katsuki Bakugo, that blonde guy with a mean expression's name, calls me ever since we were kids. It's another way you can read my actual name, Izuku, and it means worthless. He gave it to me after I failed to develop my quirk at roughly the same time as him. I eventually did develop my quirk a few months after him, so ignoring him now is quite easy." The girl was embarrassed at this point and hastened to put things right, leaving a bad taste in her mouth at the notion of perhaps offending the teenager. With a lovely little tilt of her head, she blushed and punched her temple. "Oh. I'm so sorry. It didn't even cross my mind that it could be like that. Deku, since it sounds a lot like Takeru, gives of a feeling of you can do it," she stammered. Izuku glanced at the girl again, his eyes wide with curiosity, flushing from the movement, her words, and the general cuteness he was witnessing. He started to smile slowly and eventually developed a happy smile. He grinned at the girl and replied, "Well, if that's the case, then I don't think I would mind if you called my Deku. My full name is Izuku Midoriya. What's yours?" She beamed at him joyfully and blushed pretty at the look on his face and his words, especially the way he emphasized you when referring to her. She added, seeming oddly excited at the idea of being able to call him by a nickname, "My name is Ichako Uraraka. You can call me Ichako, considering that you are allowing me to call you by a nickname." He held out his hand to greet her, saying, "Then, it's a pleasure to meet you, Ichako-chan." With a joyful nod, Ichako placed his hand in hers. "Likewise, Deku-kun." After exchanging phone numbers in case they didn't see each other again that day because they were currently being set by school, Izuku and Ichako had to part ways as they made their way into a massive amphitheater. Unfortunately for him, that meant he would have to spend an unknown amount of time sitting next to Kitsuki. He'd had enough practice to disregard Kitsuki too easily, but it didn't make it any less annoying. As they sat side by side, they were happy to ignore one another for the time being, but Izuku knew that Kitsuki would eventually say something hurtful or derogatory to him. He sighed wearily and leaned forward, resting his elbow on the desk in front of him and resting his chin on his hand. He watched in boredom as the other exam takers entered the room. As soon as everyone took a seat, Izuku became alert when he noticed a tall, skinny man approaching the platform. He had long, spiky hair and a little mustache. In addition to sunglasses and headphones, he had a directional speaker device around his neck. He had on a black jacket with studs on the collar, which was turned up. He wore black boots, black fingerless gloves, black trousers with a red belt, black trousers with studs, and a tan complexion. Izuku saw this pro hero right away. With enthusiasm, he yelled, "That's Present Mick." In addition to being a UA teacher, he was a pro hero with a weekly radio show that Izuku listened to nearly regularly. Kitsuki growled at him, "Shut the fuck up." Izuku gave him a frustrated gaze. "Look at me again and I'll make explode you until you die." Izuku gave him a flat stare for a few moments, then shook his head and turned his attention to Present Mick, who appeared to be about to speak. Suddenly, he exclaimed, "Welcome one and all to my live show." Which caused several of the pupils to jump and cover their ears in fear. Izuku simply watched, beaming. "Everyone say he." He turned to face the audience, an expectant look on his face as he cupped an ear dramatically. Izuku's response was silence, and the only reason he didn't say anything else was that he was too anxious and excited. Present Mick carried on without seeming to care that he had not received the response he had anticipated. "Listeners. All right examinees. I've got shivers down my spine too," he said, trailing off and striking a theatrical pose with his palm epically raised over his head. "I'm gonna give you the lowdown on how this'll go down. Are you ready once more?" Nobody responded to his query. But there was an unpleasant cough, so that was something. He went on, unconcerned with the silence, "Now pay close attention, listeners. We'll be testing your mettle by running a 10-minute practice run at our replica city district. You can take whatever you like. So, everybody gather your designated areas after the presentation, you dig?" When Kitsuki saw that he was assigned to battle location A and Izuku was assigned to battle location B, he sank his teeth in frustration. Kitsuki looked at the various regions that appeared on the amphitheater's large screen. His murmur was loud enough for Izuku to hear, "They don't intend on letting friends or classmates to cooperate with each other, huh? It's probably a set so I don't get to kill you," he said. Izuku disregarded him right away. The Goomba, Koopa Troopa, and Piranha Plant opponents from Mario Bros. All of them had black silhouettes, and for some reason, the numbers 1, 2, and 3 were next to the letter P in the center of each one. They were gathered around an image that was clearly meant to depict the metropolitan environment in which the test would take place. Present Mick started talking again. Mario gestured to the screen, exaggeratingly, and said, "We'll be sprinkling a large number of villains all over the battlefield. And they'll appear in 3 different varieties, with point values scaled according to difficulty." Mario's points increased as he killed each enemy, and the screen displayed this information. "Using each of your individual quirks, dispatch as many villains as you can. Your goal, listeners, is to rack up a high score. And don't even think about attacking other competitors directly or any of that nasty anti-hero stuff because that's against the rules, Kappas." The final bit was met with Kitsuki's mocking snort, which didn't surprise Izuku. Izuku ignored it in favor of concentrating on other significant details, such as the fact that the pamphlet they were handed had information about 4 foes instead of the 3 that were shown on the screen, indicating that the opponents they would be facing were robots. Unlike the other 3, the one with the X0 next to it featured the equal symbol instead of the multiplying symbol, which concerned him a little. "Excuse me, may I ask a question?" Izuku looked up from the booklet and fixed his gaze on the student who had stood up. He was tall and well-built. His eyes were slightly rectangular, too, and he wore half-rimmed spectacles with a rectangle jaw and short black hair. Izuku wasn't surprised, for some reason, that this guy was moving almost robotically. This guy needs to unwind. He thought in shock, he's already more stiff than me when I get nervous, and that's saying something. Without waiting for permission to ask his question, he declared, on the handout, there are clearly 4 types of villains listed. Such an error would be the height of embarrassment for a top-tier National Academy of UAS caliber. The reason we are seated here today is because we seek guidance on the path to becoming model heroes. What a strong guy, that was the broad idea that was going through everyone's mind. President Mick smiled, and Izuku couldn't help but think that the look was as cunning as it was ruthless, before speaking. Okay. Thanks for the segue, much appreciated examinee 7111. The 4th type of villain you will encounter is special, you can say. Let's call them arena traps. Have any of you played Super Mario Bros. Before? I doubt it since it's rather retro. Silently, Izuku believed that anyone who had not played Super Mario Bros. In this day and age was not deserving of assistance in times of need, which was significant given his unwavering commitment to aiding everyone. But keep in mind, people, that every rule has an exception. In Izuku's instance, this was it. As the pupils watched, the outline of the 4th villain appeared on the screen next to the enemy's thwomp outline. President Mick flourished a gesture towards the screen. You remember those things that'd go THWOMP on you when you went under them? The 4th villain is like that, and its gimmick is that it'll start to rampage when there's a crowd near its area. And since we are basing our 4th villain like that particular enemy in SMB, the penalty for facing it is that all the points you have earned will be deducted back to 0, so you better avoid it at all costs. Izuku's fears were validated, and he moaned at the exam turning out to be considerably more challenging than it was already going to be. He simply hoped that fighting the other villains and avoiding the villain wouldn't be too tough. Fortunately, he always had mantra at his disposal, which he was confident would guarantee that kind of scoundrel would not come near him. President Mick spoke again after that portion of the exam, when everyone had calmed down. He smiled at them all and glared at them from behind his sunglasses. Well, that's enough from me. I'll leave you all with a presentation on the school precepts of this academy of mine. As a certain hero by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte once said, a true hero never stops overcoming the misfortunes in life. Now let's move to the main event, and may you all suffer gladly the trials to come. Plus ultra. After a few minutes, Izuku and the other examinees assigned to battle location B found themselves facing a series of gates and walls enclosing a massive urban area that must have consisted of at least 30 blocks of streets and buildings. Everyone was gawking at the training area, stunned to realize that it was just one of hundreds of training grounds in the United States of America. Some smaller, some nearly twice as large as this one, they boasted. Izuku, on the other hand, started to watch everyone, taking note of all the extra specially made gear that somehow complemented their eccentricities. Izuku wasn't concerned about it because neither of his Quirks Haki nor One for All needed any additional gear or machinery, such as the belt that the attractive blonde with the sparkling eyes was wearing. Actually, all Izuku had to worry about with his hero outfit was that it wouldn't be too constrictive and that he could somehow make his already absurdly powerful assaults even more potent, but he could think about that later. Rather, he saw that Ichako was plainly trying to calm herself down as she was palming her chest in perspiration a little. Izuku began to go towards her, happy that she was assigned to the same area as him and silently swooning over how cute she looked in her tracksuit. I see what you are up to. You are planning to measure that girl's ability to concentrate, aren't you? Izuku turned to face the accusing voice, squinting his eyes at the erect-looking kid wearing spectacles who had spoken before being allowed to continue after he had inquired about it. He addressed him rhetorically in a strong tone that continued, stopping all other talk, no, I am not. As it occurred to you that we might know each other and that I just wanted to assure her that she was going to do great as long as she gave it her all. Hey, isn't that the kid that arrived here already ready for this? He was probably nervous about this. We are all, but if he is so absent-minded then there's nothing to worry about him. Izuku heard all of the remarks and simply disregarded them. In a little while, he would demonstrate to them his true abilities. Rather, his attention was drawn to the stiff youngster who moved away from him and looked at Ichako with concern. He then nodded to himself and bowed sharply, as if he were somehow able to make a perfect 90-degree angle with his body. He responded stiffly, but Izuku could hear the sincerity and genuine regret in his voice. I'm deeply sorry, my friend. Being as stressed as I am right now, I assumed you wanted to obstruct our fellow test takers. I hope you find in your heart to forgive my transgression. He said. Izuku let out a sigh and shook his head, grinning wryly. He put his hand on the boy's shoulder and gave him a gentle squeeze. Don't sweat it, man, just try to consider all possible scenarios and assume the best until the contrary has been proven in cases like this one, he said. The stiff lad gave a stiff little nod and turned to leave in a somewhat robotic manner. Once more shaking his head in laughter, Izuku turned to face Ichako, who was grinning broadly and giving him the thumbs up. With a laugh, he smiled back at her and nodded in agreement. Izuku then adjusted his mask so that it covered the bottom half of his face, rolling his shoulders and bouncing up and down on the balls of his feet. It would take all his senses to perform to the best of his abilities, thus he dared not turn on any music. Present Mick let out a startled shout at that point. "I ain't start." Listen to Warrior disturbed. All Izuku had to do was hear it to witness the gates opening abruptly and reveal the robotic baddies already strewn across the streets. He launched himself into a full-fledged sprint, his speed growing faster as he ran, and his legs got stronger. Though he could feel the others standing there in apparent astonishment and uncertainty, he grinned to himself when he saw Chaco hurrying behind him just a few seconds later. When he got to the first robotic villain, a one-pointer, he heard Present Mick begin to speak to the others. Izuku channeled armament haki into his right arm, covering it up till halfway up his biceps. Then, he rammed elbow first into the ambiguously human-shaped robot, slicing through it as if it didn't even exist. He channeled armament up to the same level as his right arm and used his left to grasp an arm that was going to fly out of control from the force of the collision that had just demolished the robot. He then threw the arm in the direction of a two-pointer, shattering that one as well. Izuku barely hesitated before sprinting ahead and suddenly finding himself facing a three-pointer that appeared to be a tank. He leaped over it, tearing off its two rocket launchers with ease, his right foot slamming the body of the tank to metal fragments and crushing its wheel as well. Izuku spun around once again and sent the two explosive devices crashing into a one-pointer and a two-pointer that were standing on the street in front of him without stopping or even bothering to look. With lightning speed, he passed through the explosions, fires and smokes, sending a shockwave that dispersed them due to the power of his movement. However, a single pointer then shot a shower of bullets in his face. Izuku didn't stop, instead, he simply raised his left arm to shield his body and face with his forearm, using mantra to sense the direction and aim of each bullet. His tracksuit's jacket sleeve was ripped apart up to his elbow, exposing armament's glossy black exterior, without even trying to fend off the barrage of bullets. Izuku nearly carelessly backhanded the one-pointer into a wall with his left arm as soon as he got to it, shattering it. Shortly after, he lifted his right arm to deflect the scorpion stinger, which resembled the tail of a two-pointer. The sound of metal bending made him smirk behind his mask. He immediately grabbed hold of the two-pointer's tail and spun twice in place, sending it flying in contact with a three-pointer. The explosion that followed caught two nearby one-pointers in flames. Izuku glanced up and noticed that there were four one-pointers peeking over the edges of two buildings on either side of the road. Izuku crouched slightly before shooting forward, causing a crater and sending out another shockwave that scattered the smoke from the third explosion he had yet to trigger. With power equal to that of shattering concrete, he crashed against the building's edge directly in front of the two one-pointers, who turned to face him. Izuku forced the arm he seized to aim at the one-pointer that was shooting at him, while he twisted his head to the side to dodge the spray of bullets from the other one that harmlessly passed by his ear. The one-pointer that had not yet adjusted its aim to hit Izuku was showered with bullets, and when Izuku pushed the other one-pointer to shoot into it, the bullet struck the robot's energy core, causing a tiny explosion. Izuku, who was still hanging from the building's cracked edge, tightened his grip around the one-pointer and then used his legs as a springboard to launch himself backwards in a straight line in the direction of the other building's edge, where the other two one-pointers were located. He dragged the one-pointer with him and in the process destroyed the first building's edge. Still in midair, he whirled around and threw the one-pointer at the player on his right, taking them both out. He then struck the second building's edge with such power that the surrounding windows broke and the concrete cracked. With both hands, he backhanded the arm that was about to shoot him, sending it flying in the process. Then, he leaned back until the robot's upper body passed the edge of the building, allowing him to see the remaining robot villain on the street, a three-pointer that was already aiming its rocket launchers at him inverted. Izuku narrowed his eyes, using his knees as a springboard once more, and propelled himself towards the three-pointer, treating the other building's edge the same way he had the first one he crashed into. Izuku immediately used the one-pointer's body as protection from the three-pointer's rockets. The black smoke of the successive explosions slapped at Izuku's shield, blurring his vision temporarily but not slowing his velocity. Izuku shot out of the smokescreen as the three-pointer was reloading, the metal burning black and the one-pointer shrinking to less than half its original size. A few feet from the building that caused the first street to curve sharply right, Izuku hurled what was left of the one-pointer away and smoothly shifted his body to ram knee first into the three-pointer's body, carving through it like cake and leaving deep trenches on the ground with his left hand, left foot and right knee. He covered his face with his right hand to prevent the debris from hitting his face as he landed. Izuku rose slowly and turned to see the path of carnage he had wrought. His lips quirked with laughter at the stunned and dumbfounded expressions on the faces of the other competitors, Chaco among them, as they too watched the devastation done by someone, most of them dismissed as inconsequential because of his purported fear. The other candidate's eyes widened in shock at how many points he had already scored. 9 1-pointers, 3 2-pointers, and 3 3-pointers. That sums up 24 points. Hey, this is easier than I thought it would be. Extremely fun too. He said to himself, his muffled voice somehow continuing on. Less than 30 seconds had passed when President Mick announced that the test was about to begin. The shell-shocked gang seemingly regained their composure as Izuku continued to advance farther into the city, and they went forward with renewed resolve, determined not to be left behind. Stiff boy Tenyuida cursed to himself as he utilized his oddity engine to get to the criminals before the others could. To his surprise, though, he was slower than Izuku, who he could see wreaking havoc on another robot-filled street. How powerful is the kid's peculiarity, and more importantly, just who the hell is that kid, he pondered while launching his rapid assault on robotic adversaries. The Chaco, on the other hand, headed straight to find her own robots to destroy, but she couldn't help but blush when she thought about Izuku, slowly rising from the ground after vanquishing all those robotic monsters. Just as quickly as a one-pointer appeared around the corner, she shook her head and gave herself a cheek smack. Pay attention, girl. Later on, you can daydream about how awesome Deku-kun is as she tapped the robot with her palm to cancel its weight and send it smashing into a wall, she thought angrily to herself. She turned to confront more of those baddies and grinned. Concurrently, within the observation chamber, the present UA. The most promising pupils taking the admission exam were displayed on multiple screens that the staff was examining. The short humanoid mouse-like creature, sporting a tuxedo and dog-like paws and a bear-like visage with a scar over his right eye, stood right in front of them and grinned broadly. A strict time limit, not knowing the amount of villains there are or where they are, and a vast battleground, nothing quite like it to bring everyone's ardor into the open and uncover their skills, he laughed. Another voice, that of a man in a white spacesuit, added, the ability to grasp the situation quickly and accurately. He was watching a video of a youngster with 6 arms, who he seemed to be exploiting to find additional baddies to take down. Insight. Another voice, evidently female, with a silky, sensual tone, remarked, the ability to stick a dynamic entry without being late to the party. She watched in fascination as Tenyuida dropped kick a 2-pointer and then, 3 seconds later, engaged a 1-pointer by using his calves engines to increase his pace. Agility. The capacity to confront any challenge with calmness and poise, stated a different person, a man, his voice somewhat muffled by his tan gas mask. Despite the cap on his head, his dreadlocks were still visible, giving him the look of a cowboy. He was watching the video of the boy with the blonde hair and the sparkling eyes smashing a robot with a laser that shot out of his navel. Judgment. And, naturally, a different voice said, trailing off from a man with shoulder-length black hair, matching black clothing, and what looked to be an extremely broad tape worn as a scarf. His palms were smoking as he panted with a savage grin, staring straight at the video of Katsuki surrounded by destroyed robots. Then, he turned to face the video stream of Izuku, who was still destroying baddies left and right, showing no indications of weariness or strain. Absolute fighting ability, he concluded. The anthropomorphic mouse observed, we can gauge their respective levels of those foundational skills by way of the point system. Oh my, we raked up a promising crop this year, didn't we? The raspy voice of Toshinori Yagi in his true form smirked almost knowingly as he flipped up the barrier that kept anyone from inadvertently pushing a red button. We can't be sure of that yet, he said. He trailed off, the real test, and pushed the button. Begins now. Everyone present witnessed the fourth villain's enormous form emerge from the ground in each of the battle zones. It wasted no time in wreaking havoc by simply moving and swinging its enormous metal arms. Which quickly caused the examinees to lose hope and begin to flee due to the villain's almost immeasurable size and the possibility that they would forfeit all of their hard-earned points if they came into contact with it. All Might said solemnly, a little let down when he saw everyone in the area of where the fourth villain made an appearance screeching and fleeing. There's absolutely no merit in taking on that villain. As a matter of fact, there is a severe penalty if you do so. Someone's true character is revealed when they are faced with an impossible obstacle they cannot overcome, he said. But when he noticed something that didn't surprise him in the least on the screen he had been concentrating on, he grinned triumphantly. But it creates an opportunity. A moment or two prior. Izuku exclaimed, and that's 95 points. As he easily made the final 2-pointer of that street. He laughed and turned to hunt for more criminals. Man, I don't know what I was feeling nervous earlier. This type of tests are my cup of tea, he said. Even with his remaining 2 minutes or so, he might be able to surpass 100 points, which would have required some sort of record, and Izuku felt like breaking it. He saw many of the other competitors fighting against robots and vying with one another to be the first to destroy a robot without accidentally using each other's peculiarities as he rounded a bend. The competitors were more than 100 feet away. When the others entered the fight with seriousness, he was unable to keep up his point-gathering pace, which led to the creation of villain robots for the less dangerous players. Basically, Izuku had to use passive mantra to locate targets while he moved around killing the robots that were searching the streets and buildings for them. He couldn't use King's will on them to make them stumble because they weren't living and didn't have a true feeling of self or will of their own, but happily his increased speed was sufficient to negate their mobility. He also benefited from the fact that, for some reason, the other competitors remained in disorganized groupings while vying for robots to destroy. Listen to Headstrong trapped. Alright, not much to do here. The earth began to quiver as Izuku was about to turn around and do just that. I'll go to another area, he said to himself. Izuku was staring at the group he had been staring at for the previous few seconds when he noticed enormous amounts of dust and debris rising from the ground some 50 feet distant. He also noticed the sound of metal cords cracking. Behind the dust, a massive silhouette emerged from the ground, dwarfing the training ground's tallest structure by a significant amount. The fourth villain's enormous shape was seen as it swung its giant arms around, creating strong winds that blew away the dust. It was holding one of the buildings with its right hand and tilting its left back, staring blankly at the gathering of heroes in front of it. If you were to engage in this one, all of the points you have gained would be lost. What the heck is going on here? Izuku mentally yelled as he witnessed the enormous robot punch the earth, causing the ground to tremble once again and kicking up more dust and debris. How are we going to avoid that while still fighting the other robots? That isn't feasible, he sighed in satisfaction as he realized that the group had avoided being crushed by the robot's massive fist, thinking angrily. Izuku halted, thinking, better get out of here before that thing gets close. He cast a last fleeting glimpse in the direction of the youngster's frantic flight from the steadily approaching fourth-type robotic enemy. He glanced past the people entering and noticed Achako, who was grunting in agony because her legs were stuck beneath a slab of concrete in a way that prevented her from using her peculiarity to make the concrete weightless and free herself. With its artificial hands spread wide in a menacing fashion, the massive robot made an apparent attempt to grasp for Achako's damaged form. Izuku let his instincts take over and let armament rush his legs as he launched forward, sending everything behind him flying back due to the power of his takeoff and the sound of air being ejected violently. He dodged the fleeing students with a mantra so that only Tenya saw him as he went by. What on earth is that moron thinking? Has he made a wish to die? And doesn't he recall that you lose all of your points when you face that villain? Doesn't he? He stopped off as he turned around and saw the fourth villain reaching for Achako, who was stuck. Oh, SHT. Izuku stepped forcefully on the ground with his right foot a few dozen feet away from Achako's position. He then bent his right leg and directed one for all towards Achako before flexing his muscles and shooting himself upwards in a blur of green, black, and white. This caused the entire street to crack and created another shockwave that broke the windows that had not yet been broken and dispersed the dust created by the fourth villain's attack. Achako felt a chunk of ice drop into the pit of her stomach and glanced up in disbelief. Deku-kun. Not at all. Izuku put his left hand in front of him and easily navigated through the enormous villain's impending hand, reversing its downward velocity and sending the arm upwards as a whole, with tiny explosions along its length. Izuku narrowed his eyes, staring at the villain's blank face as he cocked his right fist, tearing the right sleeve of his tracksuit. The whole time, everyone watching saw how the shiny black substance covered his entire arm, with red veins of power appearing down its lengths, giving the shiny blackness a darker silvery hue. Izuku started to cry in the corner of her eyes. One for all armament. Yeah. A chance for it to shine brightly and rise to the surface. Exclaimed Yagi as they all observed Izuku approaching the villain without hesitation as soon as he saw Achako was rendered unconscious. When they witnessed him boldly charging the villain and severing his arm and going through his hand, the whole staff started to smile with delight. That's right. The most important quality of a true hero. He exclaimed, fighting the want to change into his all-might form upon witnessing Izuku's arm coated in armament grow even more improved by his one-for-all manifestation. For there is nothing nobler, nothing purer than self-sacrifice. Izuku tightened his fist and struck out with his right arm, not even thinking about the consequences of his actions, tears streaming down his cheek as he remembered the months he had spent training with All Might, his words of encouragement, and the smug smile on his face as he watched him give it his all to be worth of what his idol saw him. First gear. Izuku's fist broke the sound barrier with such force and speed that it struck the enormous robot square in the face, blowing it cleanly off its body and causing another shockwave. The massive robot's body was also affected by the punch's momentum, which astonished and or awed onlookers even more. The robot skidded painfully and dangerously quickly through the ground as its components exploded one by one. If everyone looked, they would see that the walls were bent outwards by the momentum carried by the massive body of the villain, which went up in a gigantic fiery explosion a few seconds after it was stopped by the massive fence. Everyone watched as the villain left a path of destruction that was only halted by the massive fence, which had the villain's head deeply embedded into it, made of sterner stuff than the fourth villain. Izuku dropped to the ground with such agility that nobody could have dared to cry out, his right arm trembling slightly as he appeared to be appreciating the havoc he had just wrought. But headstrong trapped on hold. Izuku turned around, his shoulders drooping obviously and his shape slouching slightly. His breathing mask and hair covered most of his face, making it impossible to see what emotion he was experiencing at the moment. He moved over to where Ichako was covered in debris, bent down, and with his left arm becoming black, he removed it with ease and moved away from her. He asked her, his muffled voice seeming dull to those who could hear it, "Are you alright, Ichako-chan?" Ichako tried to rise up, but she was unable to do so due to a severe throb in her left ankle, which made her sob in agony. She closed one eye in agony and muttered, My ankle," but her attention was diverted to more pressing concerns. She looked at Izuku, almost crying. "I'm sorry, Deku-kun. I'm so sorry," she said, looking up at him from where she was lying on the ground with a dejected expression. Izuku gave Ichako a small shake of his head, took off his breathing mask so that it hung freely around his neck and then shocked everyone by bending down beside her and tenderly picking her up in a bridal carry. Ichako gasped as he looked up and saw the tears streaming down his cheeks, but he was grinning at her with relief. He murmured quietly, his tone earnest but a little flat, "That's not important, Ichako-chan. What's important is that you are okay and no one else got hurt." Speechless, Ichako just gave a timid nod and avoided looking him in the eyes. Izuku approached the other pupils gently while holding Ichako in his arms. They all gave him wide, disbelieving looks. Everyone there was aware that, based on his performance at the start of the test, he had probably scored the highest number of points. They also knew that, in order to keep Ichako from joining the University of America, he had voluntarily given up all those points. He went willingly and without reluctance to the dustbin. "Time is up." President Mick let out a startled cry, but nobody in battle location B heard it since they were too preoccupied with Izuku's choice to save Ichako, which cost him all of his points. Enya said to himself, "Of course, if it hadn't been a test with so much at stake, I would have done the same." However, he wouldn't understand how phony and empty his thoughts had been until later evening. Izuku had just set Ichako down on a scrap of metal that she could use to sit without pressing against his ankle when he felt another presence slowly move into Mantra's field of vision. He turned to see an elderly, short woman with grey hair pulled into a bun with a syringe looped through it. She wore a dress with 2 yellow buttons, a pink belt and a doctor's lab coat. She also had a helmet on her head and was carrying a cane that was shaped like a yellow and red vests. "Lads, head home." Reaching into one of her immaculate lab coat's pockets, she replied softly, "I'll take it from here, boys. Just leave it to me." She offered candy to each person she passed, saying, "Here, enjoy some Haribo candies, don't be shy now." When she finally got to Izuku and Ichako, she looked at Ichako's drooping left foot and his still slightly trembling right arm, saying, I see that there have been some injuries." She scowled in frustration. "I swear, these tests are getting more reckless with every passing year." He watched with a dully thinking, "Oh, so she is Recovery Girl," as her lips seemed to stretch as she kissed Ichako's thigh. Ichako turned to Recovery Girl and grinned sweetly and gratefully, "Thank you," saying quietly as the excruciating throbbing gradually subsided and vanished altogether after a little while. "You're going to be okay, sonny boy?" she asked, turning to face Izuku after giving Ichako some sweets. "No biggie, girly," she said. Izuku shook his head, looking down to observe that although his right arm was still trembling, it was much less intense than before. "Yeah, don't worry about it," he said. "I just went a little bit over my body's current tolerance for my peculiarity. My arm's ligaments and nerves ought to heal in a few minutes." "Not what I was asking," Recovery Girl said, shaking her head and playing with her quirk on his arm. Izuku's lips quirked, then he looked down at his fully healed arm and shrugged his shoulders, saying, "I don't regret saving Ichako-chan, but what's done is done." After a few moments. "I made the right decision, regardless of what others may think or the repercussions." He started to walk away, only stopping to stare at a guilty-looking Ichako who was struggling to hold back her tears. "It wasn't your fault, Ichako-chan," he replied in a somewhat thick voice as he tried not to cry. "It wasn't what anyone was anticipating, so quit blaming yourself. All I want is for us to be able to stay in touch, even if we won't be attending UA-OK in the future." Ichako, unable to speak again, nodded her head deeply and her bottom lip quivered. Izuku grinned subtly and said, "Thank you," nodding to Recovery Girl once more as he reached over to cover his head with the hood of his undershirt. He then jammed his hands into the pockets of his tracksuit and started to slowly leave the training ground, his form slumped and the gloomy atmosphere behind him. Viewing his retreating back, Achako couldn't help but remember how, without even considering the ramifications of his actions, he had jumped in to save her from further harm, possibly even death. After all that had happened, Achako felt that no one deserved acceptance in UA. More than Izuku, so, with an intense and determined expression on her face that made everyone back off, except for Recovery Girl, who grinned knowingly, she leaped down from her seat and started walking purposefully in the direction of the UAS main buildings. She needed to talk to a couple of people, and either they would listen to her or else. "Oh, Izuku, come here honey," she sobbed, gently cradling his head into her bosom and holding him tenderly. Inko heard the door of their home opening and closing quietly, so she hurried in with a big smile to greet her son, ready to congratulate him for passing the exam and getting into UA. The smile immediately slipped from her face when she saw the utterly devastated expression on his face, lips trembling as he squeezed his out shut, still trying not to let tears fall. "I apologize. I apologize," Izuku sobbed as he encircled his mother, letting the tears finally flow freely as his mother's consoling embrace penetrated his barriers as if they weren't even there. "Hush, my dear. Here I am." It wasn't long before Inko was crying beside Izuku as she felt pained by her son's suffering. It was worse since she didn't know what happened, and what she knew was that there was probably nothing that she could do, not that Izuku would let her even if there was. "Everything will be alright," she informed him soothingly as they both fell to their knees. Rather, she concentrated only on being his mother, since that was all she could do and what Izuku needed most right then. After worrying about it all day, Momo busied herself by finishing organizing her kitchen and bookshelves. After a week of settling into her suite, that was the last chore she needed to complete before she was finished. She was reading an advanced chemistry book on her couch while she waited for Izuku to text her to tell her he passed with flying colors. Because of this, Momo had to finish the process of moving to a new city, and Izuku had to concentrate solely on passing his entrance exams. As a result, they decided that their planned outing for tomorrow would be a celebration of Momo moving in and Izuku being accepted into UA, instead of getting together and hanging out as they both wanted. And Momo was dead certain that Izuku would never be accepted. Even if his quirk didn't involve augmenting his body to unimaginable heights, rendering him essentially omniscient within a certain range, and enabling him to effectively intimidate those less powerful than him into submission with his mere presence, Izuku had the ideal mindset to become a hero. As he showed her when he leapt in to save her, taking care of those three repulsive men without even using his quirk. So, yes, she was positive that Izuku would pass his test. In addition, she enjoyed the idea of spending some downtime with Izuku, whom she liked so much to the point where she was beginning to feel a little suspicious, so there was no reason to criticize her when her eyes widened in delight and, in an unusual move for someone who was only familiar with her public persona. The girlish squeal left her throat as she saw Izuku-kun on her phone. "Greetings," as she answered, her voice faltered a little. "Is Momo Yayoi Rozu-san here?" Not only was the voice on the other end not Izuku's, but it was also a woman's. If that wasn't unnerving enough, the woman's voice belonged to someone who had lately started crying. "Yes, she is speaking now." "With whom am I conversing?" she questioned hesitantly, feeling uneasy with this. "I'm Izuku Midoriya. Izuku's mommy is me." "Midoriya-san." Momo said as her eyes grew wide and she leaped to her feet, dropping her chemistry book to the floor. "How come? Izuku-kun, are you okay? I know UA entrance exams are hard and people who take them sometimes get hurt, but there was Recovery Girl to take care of their injuries immediately away before they grew too severe." Still, she feared the worst. She inquired hurriedly, fearing the worst. "You're not alone, Yayoi Rozu-san. Izuku is okay in terms of his physical state. The problem is..." She trailed off, clearly trying to hold back tears as her voice faltered. "Midoriya-san. Izuku informed me that he failed the entrance exam. He will not be attending UA." "Oh. Alright, screw it. Thanks for watching guys, that's it for today, so hope you enjoyed this video. If you do, please leave a like, share and subscribe. Also don't forget check out our author of this fanfic, link and details in description.